do the live message.
Do it, Kevin.
See, we need a script to read.
All right, well, I'm going to head out. Sleepy Hollow comes on in 5 minutes, so I'll see you guys later.
See you later, Jonathan.
Yeah, have a good one.
There's our welcome message. Oh,
That
here's
was
Kevin. Here's
that was
Kevin.
that was interesting.
What's that?
What just happened there? He's complaining about the Gospel of Barnabas, then he goes watches Sleepy Hollow.
Well, yeah, I guess Sleepy Hollow isn't canonical, is it?
Me and my wife used to watch that. She got bored with that.
I don't know if
I was
I've
like,
ever seen it.
oh, it's bad, but we used to just watch it for fun. It's really bad. Well, it's kind of like history mixed in with the, headless horseman. He goes around killing everybody, and
Oh, that's right.
yeah, it was really weird. And my wife's yelling at me, "You need to suspend your disbelief to watch it," because through the whole thing I'm saying, "Yeah, right." I said, "Suspend my disbelief." She said, "Yeah, it's a fiction movie. You don't have to think everything's real."
That's the
This.
thing with. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go.
That's the thing with folklore is when you're studying histories of different cultures and especially as you get into like the Middle Ages and on, they're steeped in symbolism. Um, and they are sort of pseudo-historical in a lot of ways, and there's different types of folklore. There are ones that describe lines of kings. There are ones that just teach moral lessons, like fables, like kind of like a lot of stuff that you would see from Aesop's fables, but obviously a bit more modern. Um, There's so many different levels of that, and when you're trying to understand the earlier traditions of those cultures, those pieces of folklore, though they may seem weird and kind of biased in the cultures that developed from that, they can be very good tools to understanding what those people actually thought. And there's whole areas of study that focus on that aspect. I mean, look at the study of Beowulf. I mean, that alone takes up, huge amounts of books.
None of which I'm ashamed to say I've read. I haven't even read Beowulf. I mean, I know the outline of the story, but I actually haven't read the source text. Interestingly, that movie that was based off a Michael Crichton book called well, the book was called Eaters of the Dead, but the actual movie was called The 13th Warrior, and I think that was actually based kind of loosely off of Beowulf, and it was like a combination of Beowulf and some other ancient account of like a traveling dignitary from the Arab world up into the Nordic countries. Get kind of outlined a somewhat similar story.
Yeah, I really like that movie. That I watched it a bunch of times. It was great. 13th Warrior.
Yeah, I like it too. So, right after you left Wayman last night, I mean, like a few minutes after you left, we got to the section in the book where he talks about all that stuff you were asking questions about the Qumran texts and stuff like that. So if you ever get the notion to, it's on the live if you ever want to watch it.
Yeah, I think like definitely he had a hard time when I was reading over the text, like explaining metaphor and all that, um, and the importance of symbolism is huge. I just wonder why. I just wonder why he's pushing Revelation onto Judaism. If that's the case, that it's a Christian text, like I'm wondering why. Like I know it would be mixed, and I know that the metaphors were always looked back on from the Christian point of view with Christian interpretation on it all the time, and that's one of the things that irritates Judaism to no end. So that the Good Shepherd, is seen as Jesus even in Psalm 23, where that doesn't even make any sense. He and then he comes up and says, "Oh, wait a minute, Revelation. We should be looking back." Like definitely, there's a mix of symbolism there, but it's being reinterpreted into the Christian view because he's writing to a Christian community. Like I don't like I know what he's saying. Maybe he's writing to Jews, and maybe the churches were filled with Jewish people, but when the early church happened, and they were still in synagogues, or they would go to the temple, James the Just and the early Christian church tried to stick as long as they could with Judaism, but Paul is out converting Gentiles, which is a huge no-no. And he's saying all this stuff that this John guy here was saying about what he's eating and circumcision, and he got in huge fights with the early Jerusalem church. So when he gets back, they make him go through a purification ceremony at the synagogue or at the temple to prove that he really is a follower of the early Christian church or Judaism. And that was a weird mix there with James and the early church, to the point where all the Judaism looked at him and said, wait a minute, is this the guy that's been converting Gentiles and blowing off ritual laws, laws from Torah, clean, unclean questions, all that? They were so fierce that he went through with this ceremony, and he appeared hypocritical, and they almost killed him. They ran him out of town. So but at the same time, they really liked James the Just because he put tons of time into the poor. Like even reading the text of James, they had no problem with that up to a certain point. But when it became Paul, the religion of Jesus becomes the religion about Jesus, where he starts calling him, the Christ and the whole thing. It just kind of, I think that's where that separation was made. Like, I think the Romans had a hard time with it because they didn't understand the subtleties of what was happening, because they had to deal with so many subtleties that they viewed as a threat to the government and the imperial cult and the whole 10 yards. You know what I mean? Like, so to me, like I have no idea what reason, what is his motive behind, like hasn't that study already been done where Jewish symbolism in Revelation is brought out, like, and why does he feel he needs to like have the whole text be from a Jewish perspective? If it's a Christian text to a Christian community, to Christian churches, I don't know. It's because John and Paul, those two, run in the same vein. Much different than, say, Mark did, and James the Just in the early church, and even Peter, because Peter and Paul got in fights about circumcision. And I think that the Judaizers or people that were following Paul around and annoying him were actually probably from the Church of Jerusalem. You know, I've seen that too. Ideas about that too. So I don't know. I just had a hard time with that. Like the ideas and the metaphors of apocalypticism are much different in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But then you have people from the Jerusalem's perspective, from the Christian community, being like, well, like I have no idea why they're trying to make it more Jewish. You know, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, I haven't made a decision on his whole theory so far, mainly because I haven't, you know, we're only a third of the way into the book, and a lot of what he's done so far is laid a lot of groundwork as far as clearing up confusion over terminology and stuff like that. But it seems like one of his main points of argument is that all these, in his words, supposed Christian identifiers of the text, like church, and the whole the interpreting the verse 2:9 and 3:9, where it's saying they say they're Jews but they're not Jews, they're a synagogue of Satan, like that's some kind of anti-Jewish polemical stance. And then the stuff about the Lamb, the Christ, all that stuff, he's saying those aren't necessarily Christian only concepts. And especially in chapter 7, which I don't know if you've looked at that yet, he goes into extensive use of all those identifiers that scholars have honed in on to designate this as a Christian document, and shows that they've had extensive usage in documents that no one says are Christian. And you know, he says we shouldn't be so quick to just say because it has ecclesia, or because it uses the Lamb, or uses the word the Christ, that because it has all that stuff in there, therefore we need to see this in a Christian framework. And you know, I think he's got some points there. I'm not totally convinced of his argument, but then again, he's got a lot of the book left to go, so we'll see by the time it's over. But I do like the fact that he wants us to be careful, especially with these what have been traditionally identified as Christian terms. And he's saying, well, not so fast. You know, these have usage that go back before Christianity. You know, widespread usage.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's being reinterpreted. You know, as long as he's saying that, like, say for example, Matthew and all the Old Testament references. I'm saying Old Testament. All the see, even when I do that, even when I say Old Testament, I'm saying it's something old, right? And I think about it differently, because new means I have to impress all the metaphors with this new interpretation. You know, I have to push it on it. But in Hebrew literature that is used in Matthew, you know, we could very well say, wait a minute, you know, even Matthew could be a Jewish text, you know, and look at all these miracles that Jesus is doing. They're patterned after Elijah, and you know, except in much greater format, and you know, so all that's been used before, and I don't know. I guess that was being used and interpreted that way to make a point to the community that they were writing to. So, I don't know. I'll have to take another look at chapter 7. Sorry about that, Kevin. We totally did it again to you. We started talking about some stuff that you had. We're talking about a book discussion that we had in another chat, and we didn't explain ourselves very well on that. Sorry about that.
Don't worry about it. It's cool.
Well, I need to leave for a sec. I'll be right back, all right?
Hey guys. Anybody talking? Not for the time being. I think Wayman went to go get something. So what's on your mind?
Not much. I was just invited to the hangout, so I was wondering what it was about tonight and stuff. Just checking things out.
Well, recently we were just sort of talking about biblical history, the interactions between Paul and James and John. Not a whole heck of a lot, just kind of like hashing over some ideas. They were talking about the conversation they had earlier in another chat room, kind of bringing it into the forum because it kind of went to that kind of conversation. So usually things just develop organically in here. Conversations just kind of evolve.
Just him, huh?
Welcome, Frank. How's it going?
Doing all right. How's everybody doing?
Not too bad.
Cool.
I just finished smoking some hookah earlier, so I'm nice and relaxed.
Good.
What have you been up to?
Just basically working. Getting feedback. Just working and just getting stuff trying to organize some stuff. I'm actually trying to write something, maybe an outline for a book or something like that, but I have some ideas. So I've been writing a lot.
Sweet.
Taking a lot of notes. Something to do on my spare time. How about you?
Just waiting for the credit check to come back from the apartment I signed up for. And then after that, I should be getting my move-in date. Most likely, I'll be moving next week, starting next week, most likely. Because they said it was 5 days after, and I actually went in there today because into the apartment because their phone number was a weird thing. Apparently, they have an error sometimes with their phone service. It actually goes offline once in a while, like it shows up as a no longer in service number. So I went down there, just like, oh, don't even worry about that. It'll probably be fixed by the end of the day. And tomorrow morning I'll call you when I should have it available, because she told me that it would almost certainly be done by Monday, but she didn't have time today because she's running a huge apartment, so a huge apartment complex. But after that, they told me that it would take about 5 days for me to have a move-in date, or they'll give me something like that. But who knows? Could be this week. It shouldn't take too long for me to move anyway. I mean, I could get all the furniture done in a few hours.
You're a light traveler.
Yeah, I have probably about 5 or 6 pieces of furniture that would need a truck to move. That would probably take 2 or 3 trips.
Well, good, man. Good.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Awesome. I'm excited for you.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, I've also been under the weather, so I haven't been feeling well.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that.
Kids, when you have kids, man, your immune system it just goes haywire.
Good to see you, Frank.
Hey, good to see you too. I know there's been like a Bible hangout. I think the Bible is a very complex issue to even dive into for me. That's why I kind of like the Noahide Nexus, because it had a different flavor, a different thing to it. So I was more into the Noahide Nexus, but I haven't really been having time to even go there.
You were comparing it with the Bible Geek Hangout? Is that what I heard?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have nothing to contribute whatsoever with the Bible Geek Hangout.
Yeah, the Bible Geek stuff can get pretty arcane, definitely.
Yeah. So this is the Interfaith Hangout. So was there any type of topics you guys going into?
For a minute we were discussing a book, which I don't really want to go back to because I don't want to bring that into this hangout. But then hold on, I'll be right back.
Please stand by for intermission.
Hey, how you doing, man?
Good. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Hey, Brandon, how you doing?
I feel like I'm came to a sword fight with no books. Somebody there seems to have a whole lot.
Oh, wait a minute.
Nah, it's just important whenever you're on video to sit in front of a big bookcase. It makes you look smarter. I was going to wear glasses, but I didn't have any. You ever see those guys in YouTube videos? They always sit in front of the big bookshelf, but they haven't read any of them.
Yeah, it looks pretty intimidating.
Yeah.
Like, oh crap, who are we going to debate? Wait, man, with all those books behind them? No way, man. No way. That's what I'm going to start doing, just put a whole bunch of books, but I don't have a bookshelf, so it's going to be like stacked up like behind me.
That's how you do it.
Even better, I'm just gonna get one of those pull down things, like for they have for taking pictures, backdrops. Make it look like
even better. It'll save you tons of money on all the books.
I have a kindergarten picture like that. Like when they take pictures for classes, like the individuals, I have fake books in the background. I haven't seen those in a while.
Sorry about that. My dogs decided to try and kill each other.
Yeah, it looks like they was having a conversation at one point.
Yeah, they were talking to each other with their teeth.
Who let the dogs out?
Great. Well, I'll be banned for having dog fights here on Google Plus Hangouts.
I did mute myself, didn't I? I think I did.
It sounds like they were having a debate.
Yeah, one of my dogs is a Calvinist, and the other one is a whatever the opposite of a Calvinist is.
Maybe a Catholic.
Arminian. Thanks, Reuven.
Hey, Pat. Nice to see you. I didn't realize you popped in here.
How you doing, Pat?
Yeah, I just came in like 30 seconds ago.
Anyway, yeah, Kevin and Jonathan were talking about. Well, I'm not sure exactly. A couple things came up.
Yeah, we were talking about the influence of millennials going back to church and how that affects church beliefs and policies, and how they're influencing or how they're gravitating when they're going back more towards older traditions of ritual and that sort of thing, but at the same time changing viewpoints on maybe lifestyle laws and things like that.
What we ended up sort of mentioning through the conversation was that there's essentially two currents that are interacting right now in the development of modern religions, both among world religions and among alternative spirituality, that people both want religions that respect progressive values, that are accepting of, they embrace women's rights and gay rights and things like that. They're open to other interpretations of Scripture, maybe less literalist, but still want a lot of the structures and disciplines that are inherent to spiritual traditions. And one of the people that was in here earlier was mentioning that a lot of that is sort of going on definitely in Christianity. And I can say for myself, and as I had said before, that a lot of that is going on in alternative religion. I can say specifically within the pagan community, a lot of us have moved in a similar vein that I've moved into more traditional polytheistic faiths, as opposed to some of the kind of loosely defined New Age trappings that you saw in the 80s and 90s. People are becoming disenfranchised by both. So,
I want to ask a question to the whole panel here. In your opinion, or in layman's terms, what is the purpose of rituals? Why do we have them?
Oh, go ahead, Kevin. You probably say the same thing as me.
The purpose of ritual is to get into the proper spiritual mindset. It's a sort of exercise for spirituality. That's the most basic definition I can give for you.
And it's symbolic reinterpretation or reenactment of a past event that was considered to be sacred.
Could be a past event.
Or it can be, yeah, or it can be a reenactment of
a reenactment of spiritual processes, things that are going on within the world. It's especially true of older mythologies, which are almost inherently cyclical. They're describing a process that exists in symbolic terms.
So just an example, especially, like I use this example all the time because it's a great example. In the book Black Elk Speaks from Native American religion, when he wrote that from the Ogallala Sioux, he had a dream. He was a medicine shaman. He had a dream, and he comes back to his community because his people were being forced assimilated by the United States government, and they're being targeted, and they can't have their belief system, they can't talk their language, they're getting their hair cut, all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, he has this vision, and he comes back, and he turns the vision into a dance, a sacred dance. So that is a ritual as an interpretation of a dream for the whole community, to where now they can participate, and while they're doing the action, it puts them in the mindset to act outwardly towards what's going to happen to them, and reinterpret that as a whole. Very powerful stuff. I mean, we do it all the time, probably, we don't even realize it.
Sorry, if anybody wants to comment on that.
Did you want us to go down the line, Frank?
No, basically, no. Anybody could just talk about it, and what does it really mean to you, and how does it help you?
Could you state the question again? Because I only got half of it because my internet's kind of flaky.
No, what is the purpose of rituals? What does it do for the human being, for man?
Well, that's interesting. So I would say the purpose of rituals, from the perspective of a Torah-based understanding, based off of what is dictated in the Torah, and then later emphasized in the prophets, and then the later Jewish sages, would be that the concept of ritual is to destroy a sense of individuality in the world, or a lot of people like to reiterate it in modern times as saying it's the destruction of ego, but I'll say it's the destruction of individuality, in the sense that you have to understand that the purpose of the ritual that you're performing is to bring you closer to God, and but the whole concept of bringing yourself closer to God is to destroy your own self-understanding that you are yourself a God. So it's the destruction of ego, it's the destruction of individuality, and that these set rituals that everybody else performs is to say that it brings you all closer, that you all submit to a certain kind of plane of understanding. And because the whole purpose of, at least in my faith, that our faith is presented, is that you destroy these things in order to build a better society. So everybody has to be on the same playing field, as it were. That's the whole purpose, that's the whole foundation of building a better society, that everybody's on the same playing field. So the sense of ritual, if you will, in the sense of, religious practice, is less to do with any intrinsic value, but more so the idea of being outside of yourself, in order to say that you and your individuality aren't necessarily the focal point of the universe, but everybody else is doing the exact same thing, so it puts a bigger emphasis beyond the individual to a central focus, and that would be the service of God, which would radiate back into humanity to be the idea of building a global human society. But
so then it would rein you into the other. It would bring you back in to view the other.
right. So like the traditional, and I'm sure people would argue this, like everybody argues about everything, but I would say the traditional Jewish viewpoint of all because in Judaism there's two concepts of the laws in the Torah. There's those that are apparent and those that are inapparent, not apparent. So the apparent ones are things like you don't murder, you don't steal, you don't be cruel to animals. Like those are the apparent aspects of Torah that, like, if they weren't written in the Torah, people would already do them. But the inapparent ones would be things like you don't wear, an Israelite wouldn't wear certain mixtures of fabrics. An Israelite has to slaughter an animal in a certain way. These are the kind of things that are inapparent. And the reason why they're inapparent is because there's no intrinsic value to them necessarily, but you do them because they're the will of God. And we don't put any emphasis like we think that they're God-given because there's some like greater esoteric reason behind them. Like we don't say like the reason why some animals are kosher and some animals are not aren't because there's some like great mystical understanding behind it. We just view it as like God said you don't eat those ones because you are not supposed to eat those ones. In as a saying like you're supposed to be separate from those that eat those animals kind of idea. So the concept of at least putting the emphasis of having kosher and non-kosher animals is we understand there's no rhyme or reason behind them, and the only logic behind them is to establish a concept of being not subservient, but the idea of rationalizing the concept that you have to be in a state of aestheticism to reach a higher goal. So you neglect yourself of certain pleasures in the world, which are perfectly permissible to other people, and you engage in that sense of aestheticism in order to reach a higher goal. So the idea of there being things that are in the law that are permissible and not permissible have less to do about things that are bad, and some things are bad and some things are good, but more so on the concepts are some things you should abstain from and other things there's no reason why you shouldn't abstain from them. If that makes any sense, I don't know.
Well, that makes perfect sense because we have something very similar in that sense. It's basically the rituals are there to remind us that we are not dependent on so much about creation, but God Himself.
Right. There's nothing intrinsically bad about what the ritual is rejecting necessarily. Like in my faith, in the Judaic Torah faith, there are some like concepts which we would say like are intrinsically bad things to do because they just stifle human progression, but like that's like I would say like a 1% fraction of all the other things we can't do. And we would say all those other things aren't necessarily bad for an individual to do, but you embrace those things in order to refine the individual. Like you have to have a concept of how would you say, a concept of abstinence as well as a concept of indulgence. Like, for lack of a better term, it's like, like the yin and the yang kind of a concept. Like you have to have a balance between the two in order to refine yourself.
Correct. There was another thing that I was reading with the Jung. With rituals, I don't know if anybody has the same concept, but it helps you through transitionary periods of your life, day by day, because we go through transitions. Is there any talk about that when it comes to, transitionary periods of your life? And it could be, I know, like in Judaism, they have something where they have the bar mitzvah. A person will go through certain transition stages upon their lives, and these rituals help in order to take that person towards the other level of their lives.
Yeah, I think in our society it's lacking, and that ends up being a problem, like in secular society, because a lot of people get confused at what place they're at because they don't have those types of rituals to say you are definitely here. From this point on, you are viewed as this or that, or you will do this and that, or you are now a member of, this group of people, or you have now graduated because you went to man camp. You're now a warrior from here on out. You are not what you were before. When you come back, you're something different.
So, at least in my my camp, I guess you say, of quote-unquote Judaism, the concept of bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, so like bar mitzvah for boys, bat mitzvah for girls, is very different than you would see in the Western traditions of Judaism, mainly because we train our children from the age of 3 or 5 in these processes, where you see in a lot in the Western traditions where they're definitely trained in certain aspects of their faith from that age. But once they start getting closer to bat or bar mitzvah, they start pounding a lot of aspects of their religion before on that. So like when they reach that age, they can progress. But I guess like the idea of what bar and bar mitzvah represent is the idea of like once an individual hits a certain age. For boys, it's 13, or the sign of puberty, and for girls, it's 12, or the sign of puberty. Depending on the individual, they are now personally responsible towards their own faith, if you will. So that's like the whole concept. I'm sure everybody understands that. The idea of like once they heard a certain aspect of maturity, they're no longer they're no longer under the auspices of their family as far as their religion goes, but it's on the individual. But what's interesting is it's not really a rites of passage traditionally in Judaism. It's become that more recently in our history, but it's what really is demarcation between being a child and being an adult. Like there's no concepts of like being a teenager, let alone being like a tween kind of idea. Like you were a child, that means you're in the auspices of your family, so any sin you did would be counted upon your parents, because your parents should have raised you in a proper way that you didn't falter in that way. But after that point, it's on the individual to make their own repentance, become a better individual, etc., towards that degree. It's kind of hard now because we're under the auspices of modern, specifically modern Western civilization, where we have like the idea of you don't really mature until you're like 18 in some places, 19 in some places. So it's a little bit more difficult to rationalize it with the ancient traditions. But if you just look at it from a base point of like there's a cutoff between being a child and being an adult, there's no in-between stages. And that was really even the case in a lot of Jewish societies. I would even say the majority of Jewish societies until like the last generation. Like in my chain of tradition, not my rabbi and not my rabbi's rabbi, but his rabbi, he was the chief rabbi of his community when he was 14. And we're talking about like pre-World War II, but like not that close kind of idea. So it's the idea of having somebody as an adult at the age of 14, 15, 16, whatever, already being married off wasn't so alien. So the idea of a child versus an adult, not too long ago, the lines were much more closer than we have in our modern day and age, where we have like, I think even in those who, I guess all of us live in North America, the idea of having a differentiation between adult and adult and childhood was only marked by teenagerhood coming in post-World War II. So that was a big difference. But the coming of age for us was the idea of like from birth, for Jews, from birth, at least from the age of 3, you would train your child up to the age of a certain age, and then they were officially an adult. It wasn't like a coming of rights ceremony necessarily. It was kind of like the whole time of your child rearing, that was their coming of age ceremony. And once they hit that perfect age, it's like they're off on their own. They're getting married. They're doing their own thing. Sorry.
No. It's definitely the case within your tradition, but I think it's important, since we're getting onto the subject of coming of age sorts of things, that was definitely not the case in ancient Greece and Rome. In Rome, I mean, there were stages. Like, you would get into adolescence, and then there was a sort of pre-adulthood, and then you were an adult after that fact. I mean, there was very much how we would kind of commonly consider adolescence in Greece. That was a thing. Oh. You were an ephebe. That was a thing that existed, and then you became an adult past a certain point.
Okay, that's right. I would say for sure for us as well, it's just not as clear defined as how I was saying, like how people define like what a bar mitzvah is in the modern day and age. But like, I'll pull up the passages in our ancient text where it like defines what a person should be doing at one age versus another age versus another age, like how you progress. So there's definitely that. So continue.
And there's little things too, like some of which has actually been transferred into our modern culture. The haircut. And it was different in different societies, but at least in Athens, you would get a haircut when you became pubescent, basically. That it was a sort of rite of passage. The cutting of the hair was an actual sort of rite of passage, because the barber shop, and basically what had been the analog for the barber shop in ancient Greece and in Rome, was a sort of public forum in the way that it is now, where it's a bunch of men and adolescents who are talking about the world, and you're interacting with people who actually live and work there, and obviously there's the voting process, the polis, and all that, and a lot of people kind of chat there, and you weren't inducted into that until it was felt that you had enough self-determination to be able to handle that sort of conversation. And that's just one very sort of almost cultural, secular example of that in Greco-Roman culture. And there were definitely other ones, actual public festivals that centered on a lot of that sort of aspect. So, I think it's just different in every culture. You know what I mean? The rites of passage are different in different cultures. You know, circumcision, the cutting of hair, whether or not you can grow a beard or not, and that's just within the male spectrum. Obviously, with women, it's a bit different. What kinds of clothes you're allowed to wear. There's definitely something that you see fairly commonly, though, in many cultures, that when you are a prepubescent, that your clothing is far more neutral. It's far less sexually dimorphic in quality. It would have been common, and it was definitely common in northern cultures as well, that if you were a boy or a girl, you kind of wore pretty much the same kind of clothing until you got to a certain point when, okay, you have male things now and female things to deal with, so you're going to be slowly inducted into that process.
Very super interesting, yeah. So I could break down kind of something similar in my tradition, and I found it. This is in the Mishnah, which is like the basis of one of the base texts of our faith. And this is in chapter 5, and it's in Halacha 21. It says Ben Bagbag, and Ben Bagbag is like a name. So Ben Bagbag would say, delve into it, i.e. the Torah, for all is in it. See within it, grow old and worn in it, and do not budge from it, for there is nothing better. Ben Hehe would say, according to the pain is the gain. He would say 5 is the age for the study of the Torah, or of the Bible, 10 for the study of the Mishnah, 13 for the obligation, the observant, and the commandments, 15 for the study of the oral law, 18 for marriage, 20 for the pursuit of a livelihood, 30 for strength, 40 for the understanding, 50 for counsel, 60 for sagacy, 70 for elderliness, 80 for power, 90 for the stoop. 100 years old is when one has died and passed away and has been negated from this world. Or no, sorry. I mean, 100 is as if one has been died. One is as if one has died and passed away and has been negated from this world. Kind of the idea. At least the only, I don't have much commentary on it, but what I've understood for the last point about being 100 is the idea of like you shouldn't have anybody who's that old in a position of authority. They're like gone. Kind of idea.
Now, given the fact that there were different Jews in different sections of the continent, and did they all adhere by that? Because it's probably contingent upon the environment. Let's say if they were somewhere a little bit more tropical, other than people that were really up north, somewhere in colder climates. Does that change?
At that point, there wasn't that division necessarily. There were definitely Jews as far south as Arabia, like what we would say, like Arabia and Eritrea and Djibouti. There are definitely Jews that far south, and there's definitely Jews in probably by that time it was written. There's definitely Jews as far west as Jerba, which is an island off of Tunisia, and as far east as Iraq. So, but they're still very centralized in that aspect. They're still in correspondence.
Mm-hmm.
There are definitely different sects for sure, like throughout that area. But as far as like them being very dispersed, they were still very centralized. They weren't as far west as Tunisia, not as far east as Iraq, maybe Iran, still a little bit, and not as far south as like modern. They weren't. They were probably like southern Arabia, which would probably be like Yemen today, as well as part of East Africa. Not as far north as, for sure, not as far north as Greece.
Yeah, and that's true. That there are certain laws that definitely you can stay consistent because of those. It's not that spread out. I was like thinking if there were somewhere in the tropics or somewhere out west, even out to Japan, where the laws will probably have to change contingent upon its environment.
That happened, but later, I would say later.
Later, yeah.
But that migration for sure happened. I won't deny that, but later after that text was written. But that's not to say that all Jews that made that migration adhered to that text. Especially not Samaritans, but I don't think Samaritans made a great migration.
Okay. Yeah, I always wondered, because of how we, stages of development changes throughout their people's environment, because somewhere else an adult could be considered as 14, as in other places they could be 18. And a lot of times, even let's say if you had a religion where it had a strong oral tradition, that things will fluctuate because of it, contingent upon its environment, because the environment definitely has something to do with a lot of, let's say, even spiritual practices, or even spiritual adherence, as for example as dietary laws or something like that.
Right, and for sure, like even though in that text it labels certain ages, there's like once you go into it in depth, it says like that's only based off of like the could say the kind of concept of first, like if we're talking about maturity, it's based off of like visible signs of maturity. That's like you're not going to marry off a child if he's 13 and he hasn't really reached the physical signs of pubescence and all that stuff. As well as with learning certain texts, you're not going to push a child once he hits a certain age. You're not going to say, oh, now if you learn this text, if he's like maybe a little bit slower in his learning, maybe has like a learning deficiency or the like. So like that's like the broad framework. But within that broad framework, there's kind of like stipulations of like what that actually means. Like what does it mean when you're 13? It doesn't mean when you hit a certain age. It means that you've reached physical signs of maturity, kind of idea. So like there's like the broad overview of how the framework works, and then there's like an underlying law of like what these actual terms mean as far as maturity, biologically, as well as like developmentally, intellectually as well. Like if they can comprehend what they're learning, then they move on to the next phase. You don't just like push them on because they've reached another age. So it just would make no sense otherwise.
Correct. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think there are some problems, even within my faith, that there are some that adhere to laws and they stay very static. It doesn't really won't allow to fluctuate because of the times and the things like that, and then you have a sort of a a very rigid type of system. So that's the thing that there are some groups are able to do, and some groups they're really stuck within their own mindset. I don't know if you guys have some of the same issues where they stay really rigid regardless of the time and the environment.
Yeah, of course. I think that's true about every kind of belief system. At least I could say for mine, for sure.
Yeah. How would a person of faith will counteract that? Is it through study? Is it through rationality, or is it something that you go outside of the text in order to modify it for those times? Is that possible?
Like, from my perspective, like, you have to have like a centralized kind of like a pillar that everybody stands upon. So if that pillar doesn't, or that pillar, and when I say pillar, I don't mean like a text, I mean like a chain of tradition, or like a centralized concept of how you interpret your particular faith. If that doesn't, if that's not leading towards capability of inserting modern secular, as we would say, interpretations of the text, or at least interpretations of your faith within it, then I think it's kind of futile. So, like, I can understand. Sorry.
Go ahead. I was just being dumb.
I was just saying, like, the concept of like, if you can't have, like, I think it's futile to say like, certain points. This is. I would say it would be futile to say about certain points, maybe of science, that this is intrinsically true and my faith can prove it, if there's no reason for your faith to prove it. For my faith, you can like, I would say there's plenty of aspects of science that your faith doesn't necessarily prove that you can accept, and it doesn't contradict each other. But I mean, as far as like modern science or modern philosophies, if you're trying to prove it to another person, part of your faith, and you can't root it within a logical, what Jews would say a Masorah, like a chain of tradition. If you can't root it in that, then it's kind of futile. Like, you can't like tell, let's say you can't tell like from like another perspective, you can't tell a Christian who doesn't agree with your perspective that, oh, I believe this because I believe it, not because this quote unquote chain of tradition it completely corresponds with this. If that makes sense. Like, you have to have like the degrees. So like, at least for my faith, like, personal belief about something is different than public belief. So you can personally believe in something that can be exactly okay, but your public belief and your declaration of that belief has to be rooted in like a concrete source for you to like actually present it to other people. Because I could say, oh, I believe that I believe that wearing Adidas shoes are better than Nikes. There's nothing wrong with me personally believing that, but if I was to present it to another Jew, he'd be like, okay, well, what's your chain of tradition? What's your source? Give me your exegesis to say that Adidas are better than Nikes, kind of idea.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I noticed when I was attending evangelicalism, they did not have. And like you're saying, it would have been so helpful, because a lot of people in those environments would press their personal convictions on other people in that community. So say, for example, if so-and-so believed God might have told him that he couldn't touch or be around alcohol or eat even in a place where alcohol was served at a restaurant, they would tell you that too. And then all of a sudden you have these strange kind of mixed morality laws that were created between churches between denominations even, on strange things, like in retaliation to, say, maybe Hollywood back in the day, they weren't allowed to have televisions, or in retaliation to a certain dress or style that was coming out, your tie couldn't be too wide or too thin, or all those kinds of things. And it was amazing. Like, my parents, they were totally into that, but my parents also knew where to draw the line, because my dad was a farmer. He wasn't going to, do haying in the hayfield where it's hot in long sleeves. And he was criticized a lot for that, because church members would show up and say, "Oh, you're a member of our church. Why you have long or short sleeves?" And he's like, "Ah, it's hot." Then he would say something back to them and point out, some crazy thing that they were doing against this moral code also, and then that's where the line would be. But there was a lot of that going on, where the personal convictions, because one person had a problem with it, they impress it on the community, and then it ends up becoming a communal law for reasons that not the whole community would understand. Then there was a breakdown between those laws and explaining that to the younger generations, because you would hear it from the pulpit, but the children would not be able to identify why those things came in to play in the first place, and for those reasons. And so there was a lot of, there was a lot of disconnect between, at first, why they were doing it, and then explaining it, because even at times they themselves would forget what they were retaliating against, what the law was for, and then it just ended up, well, it's in the Bible. We believe in this code and this code, and they throw a scripture verse with it, and they tell the kids not to do it, which never made sense. And it kind of put a lot of kids who were questioning in youth camp and stuff like that in a lot of disillusionment around those types of morality, dress code, modesty laws. It was amazing.
Yeah, but I think that transcends like all faiths. The kind of the idea, like my personal doctrine, I would dictate into my faith kind of idea, and like I think that's just natural. Like I have my own personal doctrine, but I would say I'm kind of completely arrogant to say that my personal doctrine is like the true interpretation of the faith necessarily. But that doesn't mean that other interpretations I would have to like adhere to. But if I like, it's happened like a few times in my life where I've been like very steadfast, like this is the way it's supposed to be, and somebody else just like, couldn't brought about a better argument, and I was like, oh, okay, I guess, and then like I switched. Like I can say like I can remember at least 3 times where it's been like a complete 360-degree shift, not just like a slight different understanding, but like completely a different understanding, and I switched otherwise. And I think that's, but I think this might also be like the backbone behind this entire group, and maybe Reuven or Kevin could tell me wrong, but the idea of like having a totalitarian view of truth in and itself is flawed, because if you're not open towards being wrong about what you believe to be the ultimate truth, especially about, I guess, faith or whatever you would want to define it as, is in and itself a flawed worldview.
Well, it's a very difficult position to hold if you think that way, because I don't know how could a person be in peace if they have that type of mindset of everything. There's a saying, that if you're gonna have a garden, you can't have a bunch of like one type of flower. It won't be beautiful, because you have to have different types in order to make a beautiful garden. Even though it comes, from the same stem and same roots. But the difference is within the beauty of, You know, you
Yeah.
have you have a group of flowers here. You have a group, but it makes the garden even more luxurious.
A great story I heard firsthand. It was a great Torah scholar. Um, her name was Rabbanith Kappa, and she took a group of us walking through a garden, and she said, like, look at all these flowers. God could have made just one type of flower, but he decided to make all these different flowers, and that's like the aspect of it. Like, they're all flowers, but they all look different, kind of idea. And that's the lesson that's the lesson God's trying to teach us. The idea of like he could have just made one. He could have just made one kind of path, one kind of like, I guess you could say, one kind of like central concept of what a flower should be. But he didn't. He made all these variations of petals, petal lengths, colors, patterns, all these things. And that's the idea, that we should understand that God puts his mercy upon us, that we in ourselves could be individuals, all adhering to be a flower, but each flower manifests itself in a different way. And I thought that was a very, very powerful lesson in itself.
It's also stated in the Quran about, he could have made you all as one, but made you different in order for you to come together and know each other. And that's similar type. So it's very well understood when I first heard it too. I mean, definitely you could see it. You could definitely see, given the analogies of nature and what makes nature and beautiful and wondrous in that sense. That's why it's a very hard concept to even think about, as far as trying to convert others into your similar belief patterns, thought patterns in a sense, and I find that very disturbing, but I guess there's a reason for it. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, it seems to me too that ritual plays an important social role. I think it helps to reinforce social norms and kind of nurture group cohesion or group ethos, and like we guys were talking about earlier with the rites of passage types of rituals, I think that's another, plays a very important social role, and I think that dimension of ritual is very important and very general, regardless of the specific tradition that the ritual is practiced within. Anyway, my 2 cents.
Yes, as society, correct. It was like when a group does it, there's a sense of, I think, Path, you talked about the loss of individuality, in a sense, and I think that was the whole purpose of what we call zikr, where we kind of repeat the names of God, and the whole point about those type of rituals, those zikrs, is for that group becomes one. There's no type of consciousness of the self, but basically it becomes one thing. You lose that individuality. Maybe Doug, probably in the sense that probably that's why we have these group rituals. I was going to ask another question about, now, are there any types of spirituality that actually doesn't have rituals? And, what do you think about a type of spirituality that doesn't have a ritual at all? Or is that even possible?
I think it would depend on how broadly you want to define ritual. I mean, because you could have completely non-spiritual ritual, But
Yes.
yeah, I can't think off the top of my head of a general spiritual form that doesn't include any kind of ritual. I mean, there may be individuals who have like this weird, very personal synthesis of spirituality and don't have ritual, but as far as like a well-recognized form of spirituality without ritual, I can't think of any.
Because one comes to mind is evangelicalism. Like it's certain types of Christianity where it doesn't have a formalized ritual, but they do things that are very similar, but they're not like formalized in a way.
They like I watched a documentary once where they had I assume they're evangelicals because they're American Protestants. But they had the idea of like having like this like virgin kind of purity kind of ritual where like the daughters and the fathers would be commended. They like do like this whole, I don't know if it's a ritual, but they do this whole like ceremony where the daughters would say that they remain virgins until like they're married, and the fathers would like kind of lead them. It's kind of bizarre to me because it kind of looked like a marriage ceremony, but like it'd be like the bride was like the daughter and the groom was the father, and all they were obviously they weren't marrying each other, but they were saying like the daughter would say I would remain a virgin, and then the father would say I'm like a witness to it. And I've heard this is like very common in a lot of states in America that they do this, but I don't know. I'm not American, so I can't say, let alone Christian.
Yeah, and this is the thing. I guess in the sense of formalized rituals, and spiritualities that doesn't have that formalized ritual, because like with us, there's steps. There's steps that you have to remember. There's verses that you have to, at least you have to do a verse, from the book, from the Holy Book, and these are just basic things that you need to do as far as that, as much as you can. But there's other faiths where, well, spiritualities that doesn't require you to do that at all, or there's no type of formalized ritual. And it's not to say that they're less valid, but the only one I can really think of is some of the Christian denominations here. Otherwise, with Catholics, they have a very specific type, rituals that they actually perform. Orthodoxy is another example. Yeah, the whole sense of some of the Christian denominations actually does bother me. I don't know. It's almost a form of a strange corporate type of faith, and that's sad to say. It's not to say all, but it's very media-based orientated. But who knows? Maybe this is another topic of discussion too.
Yeah, I don't want to get in without any like practitioner,
Yeah.
but I mean
Yeah.
like the only Christians I ever interact with are those at school, and all of them are Orthodox. From like they're like Syrian, Ethiopian, Iraqi, and Romanian Orthodox, and they like view like Protestants as being like this weird kind of like alien entity that has less to do with Christianity and more to do with about like American like politics, if anything. So like I don't like to talk about Christianity because I know I have like this warped view from like a very, for lack of a better term, traditional native standpoint versus like a lot of the Christianity that's being propagated in the West, which is being really coming from America, from American Protestants. And I'm like, well, obviously that's crazy because the only Christianity that I know is from Orthodoxy. So it seems weird to me from like the rationality that I've been proposed from in real life encounters, and like the encounters that I have for Protestants on the internet have largely been through YouTube videos, and they also seem rational. But like a lot of the concepts coming out of America as being like very like stringent about their faith have been very at odds with at least how I interpret my Bible when they quote it kind of idea. So like I try not to comment on it because I know I'll have like a bias, both from a Christian bias and from a Jewish bias. So it's difficult for me to understand some of these concepts without actually talking to a person who's saying them.
No,
And it would be great if we could have like one of those very Bible-belt Protestant Christians come into this hangout to flesh out ideas.
no, I definitely agree with that. You know, the reason why I kind of brought it up because it has something to do, and maybe no correlation at all, as a faith having no formalized ritual. When we talk about that, but that may be.
I think a big reason that evangelicals especially, but them in particular, but Protestants in general have distanced, or some of them, some denominations, seems like they've distanced themselves from ritual because they're distancing, it goes back to distancing themselves from the Catholic Church, which is heavily ritualized in a formal way. And, you know, they wanted to get away from that, oh, what's all this stuff we're doing that this isn't in the Bible? We only want this. We only want what's in Scripture. There's no, Eucharist as far as we have to do this as a regular thing. That's not in the Bible, or any of the ritualized stuff. I think that a part of it is they just have a kind of a bad taste in their mouth from ritual in general because of their disagreements with Catholicism.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, what's funny is the flip side of that coin is they roll in it. Like even though they're saying what you just said, Doug, they're like, we want to get away from it all. We want to have nothing to do with it. But at the same time, they roll in it. They have snake handling, feet washing. They still do communion, maybe with Welch's grape juice instead of wine. They have all those kinds of things, and it ends up being highly ritualized to the point where if you went into a church and you sat in the wrong pew, somebody might complain about that because that's where Sister So-and-so sits every Sunday. And it's amazing like what kind of things they actually get into.
Yeah, Pentecostals have definitely not given up on ritual.
Even with dress, I know Pentecostal females, they have skirts. They always wear skirts. And it seems like every denomination, no matter how small, they have their own certain type of formal ritual. Even though it's strange, it's like it's not really formalized, but yeah, it is. I don't know how to explain it.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like when I came out of evangelicalism, I was able to tell pretty much what denomination people were from by the type of dress that they wore, or modesty laws, all that kind of stuff. And the other day we were at a yard sale, and I happened to see these people, and I was like, oh, these people here, I don't know them, but they appear to be from, one of the older churches that were in my ex-denomination. And I was like, that's pretty fascinating, and, I was like, my wife was like, well, how would you know that, and I said, well, these people, even though they have their hair up, they're not wearing hairnets, over the bun, and their sleeves are just below their elbows and not above, and they're wearing skirts to their ankles. Some would believe, maybe skirts up, just below the knee, or they're allowed to wear maybe a half cut down their arm, but this was much different. And so I went over, and here they were relatives of people who were part of that, and I haven't seen very long, and we had a conversation, whatever, how's mom and dad doing, blah blah blah, and to me, those subtleties are amazing that you would be able to even do that. It was amazing.
I think it's like fundamentally interesting, especially from my perspective, the idea of like, I guess it might be similar with any other faith, that the idea of authenticity is like, it makes it. But with, especially with Judaism, authenticity doesn't necessarily dictate what's proper. So like, you could like, for instance, like you'd have Samaritans saying like, we still sacrifice Paschal offerings, and we'd be like, well, you're wrong, idea, regardless if you're doing an authentic practice. But I mean, at least from my particular aspect of Judaism, it would be that you have to do like the most authentic understanding of the law, be it the Torah or like what's the injunctions of the Sanhedrin. This is the Sanhedrin, and your interpretation of it might be individual in certain aspects, but you would have to back it up. And I find that very interesting in comparison to Christianity, where like they might not be able to back up, like for instance, you're saying like hairnets or something like that. They might not be able to back it up with like straight text, but they could say like, this is a much better way of doing it. Whereas from my understanding, and it's definitely true in Judaism, where they would have like concept of maybe not hairnets, but the same idea, where they'd be like, this is the best way of doing it, even though they can't back it up why that is the way they do it. But from my perspective, it's definitely the case of like, if you're going to say I'm wrong, then we have to go to like a text that we all agree upon. But what's interesting about at least Protestant Christianity is that they only agree upon the Bible, it seems, as being like the primary text to agree upon. So like I would love to understand the idea of like why if the only text that they're utilizing as being like authoritative being the Old and New Testament, that they would say like, oh, hairnets are the best way, or bonnets, or you know what I mean, like, or some like a cloth or something is the best way. How they would justify that kind of interaction. So I'd really find that interesting to understand that kind of deliberation.
This is where I think evangelicalism, to some extent, has some similarities to Judaism in one aspect, and that in the same way Judaism has that concept, building a hedge around the Torah, so you don't even get close to violating the commandments. Evangelicals do similar things when it comes to like just to use one example, Paul, somewhere in one of Paul's letters, he says that men shouldn't wear long hair. It's inappropriate, or women should cover their heads in church. Things like that. So they'll read stuff like that, and they'll do a similar process where they'll kind of extend it even further. They'll add on modesty rules, so they don't even get close to breaking what they view to be like, authoritative rules when it comes to modesty. So the stuff with the skirts going down to their ankles, or they have to go below the knees at least, or sleeves going past the elbows, I think all that kind of comes out of that general view that, it might not be specifically enumerated within the text, but we're just going to be careful and beef up the rules a little bit so we don't even get close to being in violation of anything.
Yeah, and what's funny is in the same Sunday where they're going over the rules of modesty to the kids, they may preach a sermon about how Judaism hedged laws, as an anti, you know, in the same breath. It's amazing.
Yeah.
But like not when it comes to
this is the New Testament, and we're not under that anymore. We're under grace. However,
yeah, exactly.
you have to wear.
Homosexuality is still
Right.
bad, kind of idea. Yeah. Leviticus says so, so it has to be right. Unlike anything else Leviticus says. I hear what you're saying. It's very interesting. I really don't understand like the exegesis behind it, but I guess from what I've understand mainly from Hangouts, there's no exegesis. It's just kind of
Well, if I get a chance, what I'll do is I'll try to get the actual book document from my parents' denominational doctrines and modesty law book from I forget what they call those, from the conference on procedures and whatever, and you can look in there, on those dress codes and stuff, and they have reasons, and they're scriptural reasons, but like you're saying, like it's really hard to connect for the real reason why they're doing it, But an interesting thing that happened, though, we weren't allowed to have TV in the house. Mom and Dad never did, because they made rulings on it. I think it was, there's a lot of, back when the denomination was formed, there's a lot of retaliation to movies and Hollywood, and TV was first coming out. They said no to all that. They didn't want to get mixed up into the, assimilated into secular societies, So we didn't have TV. Computers came out so quickly, they didn't make rulings on it. People already had computers before they could make a ruling. Ministers were using them to create sermons, all kinds of stuff. Kids were playing video games. Oh, that was huge, bad. So then they started filtering. Well, I was at the minister's house playing with his kids when we were little. We were playing this video game. The mom says, you can play the video game, but you have to turn the sound off. They say, why? It's Psych Bite, man. We like to play Psych Bite on Nintendo.
yeah.
Oh, that music is too worldly, and it's rock music. You cannot listen to that. We'll mute it. You can play the game. So the board games, we could not use dice. We had to use spinners. So they would adapt all these things. So mom and dad can now watch DVD movies on their computer and still be in compliance, but mom still will not have a TV in the house. It's great.
Could you explain the concept of differentiation between dice and spinners?
Well, the dice, they believed, was used for gambling. You roll the dice, and then whatever number comes up for children's games, like Parcheesi or any of those kinds of games, but they would put a spinner in instead with the numbers in a circular fashion, and you spin the little arrow.
Got it.
That's really bizarre. I mean, that's really straining at gnats and swallowing camels.
No playing cards at all. We could play Uno and things like that, but my mom would never let me touch any kind of, like playing cards or anything like that. My cousins would say, "Hey, Al, you want to play Go Fish?" My mom would go through the roof, with real playing cards.
Whoa, interesting. I'm sure, like, I'm not trying to say it's like Judaism is very much different. I'm sure there's like definitely sects that are like, especially in not to sound racist, but especially in European-centered sects, that's definitely the case. At least where the position of where I'm coming from, is the idea of like, you have to prove it to me that it's wrong from like primary sources, otherwise I don't care. So that's why like so many people in my community like use the internet and whatever. A lot of us don't use the TV or cable, but we won't say that it's like the work of the devil and it's evil. We just don't use it because like we have no purpose for it. But we'll use the internet for like things like this kind of idea, or YouTube or whatever. But yeah, it's very interesting. But I think Reuven could understand as much as I can. There's definitely people who would say like any secular, quote unquote secular concepts are like, you got to root them out. But
So,
it's definitely not the overall case for all very stringent, ultra-Orthodox Jews. But I don't want to speak for everybody, of course.
now, see, my mom, I like the river a little bit because she's getting older. My mom's about 80 now, and you know, so she plays bingo. And I said, Mom, isn't bingo a form of gambling? So she was very precise. No. She says, I don't play for money. I said, well, Mom, when you go to the fair, you could pay for money, and then you could pay a tithe on that. I said, so then you would be stealing money from the devil if you just donated all that to charity. I was like,
Right.
how good would that be?
Right.
Oh, no, that's still gambling. She will not buy lotto tickets, nothing.
I bet she has car insurance though.
But like,
Yeah, she
I wouldn't even use like from my personal standpoint, I wouldn't even buy like lotto tickets or scratch tickets or any of that stuff because I'm like, I know I could use my money for better circumstance. Like, there's a chance that I might be able to win, and that'd be amazing. But I'm like, statistically speaking, I probably won't win that much, so I'll just spend my money on like a greater for a greater cause. But if somebody wants to do that, that's on them. Like, they're completely free to do so. I won't say like they're doing evil or anything like that. That's a little much.
You know, I
Plus
heard
the
it.
odds are like 1,000,000,000 to 1 or something.
I heard a statistic, I don't know if it's true or not, that I think somewhere near 90% of people who win the lottery end up basically broke after, I think it's like 10 years or something, some pretty short amount of time. And I wonder if it's just a connection between, you know, I'm not trying to cast judgment if you guys play the lottery or anything, but there may be a connection between the people who play the lottery, the type of people that play the lottery, and then what they do when they get tons of money. You know, there may be a connection there. I don't know.
Well, Skinner actually talked about that type of behavior, that gambling type of behavior, that is constant reinforcement.
Mm-hmm.
Like the slot machine, it's the lights and the things, it's very attractive, and you're reinforced by the sound of and the lights of winning. So you constantly keep doing it again, and I think if you have a person that's constantly doing lottery tickets and things like that and scratch off, they're constantly being reinforced by the winning itself. So it's not surprising that their money is gone because of the way they spend their money. If you're spending so much money on lottery tickets, thus you win, you're probably going to spend more on gambling, you know, higher stakes. And yeah,
Addiction, like the definition of an addiction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Constantly being reinforced by, you know, the act of winning. It's not so much the money, it's just the act of your reinforcement.
I have a question towards Kevin, if I may. What are the significance of because I guess Wayman mentioned it. No, not Wayman. Somebody else mentioned it. The idea of like oh wait, sorry. Now I'm gonna have to backtrack. It wasn't in this hangout, but it was something I read before that dice were utilized as a part of divination and European paganism, for lack of a better term. Not to be offensive, I don't know. But
Yes, dice were used often. We don't have a whole lot of information on necessarily how they're used, but with the Greeks and the Romans, we do. The oldest form of dice that exist were made from sheep knuckle bones, and they use a tetrad system of 4 sides as opposed to 6. And there's ways of doing that. Each of the sides having specific values. I think it's 1, 3, 4, and 6, something like that. And there's a system to how you can get certain numbers using that. It's like this with cards. It's like this with dice. All of the things that you use for gaming were originally used for divination on some level. Dice especially is the case. Hexagonal, or what's the term for six-sided? Hexagonal? No.
Hexagonal.
Anyway,
yeah.
maybe that's what it is. I'm not sure. There's probably some specific word. But six-sided dice was his development that allowed for a lot better kind of odds for gaming, but it was could also be used for divinatory purposes. It's a little unclear if they actually use regular six-sided dice, but the system of six-sided dice is much, much easier to get the system. And there's a divinatory system floating around there that I personally use that uses the six-sided dice. And what it does, you're aware, obviously, that in Hebrew, each of the letters has a meaning. The name of the letter has a meaning.
Yeah.
Well, the Greeks interacted with the Phoenicians, who were a sort of cousin of the Jews, and had a very similar alphabet. That's where they got their alphabet from. So they were constantly interacting with Near Eastern peoples who had this kind of alphabet. So when they were developing the Greek alphabet, they already had symbolic representations of what each one meant. So the one that we have is called the Olympic divinatory system. I mean, it has all kinds of different meanings, but each one of them has a different meaning associated with them. And what you do is you roll six-sided dice, and 30 is alpha, and 5 is omega. You omit the values of 13 and 25. 13 as there are only 12 Olympians and 12 hours on a clock. 25 because there's only 24 hours in a day, and 25. These are odd numbers. These are numbers.
Interesting. Yeah.
They exist out of order. So in the system, usually if you roll a 13 or a 25, it's, oh, okay, I should re-roll, or maybe I should ask again sometime else, or maybe I should pay closer attention to what I'm asking. The system's really basic. You could also theoretically do it like how a lot of Germanic pagans now use runes, by having tiles. What the Greeks would have done would have been potsherds. There would have been, pieces of pottery that were broken up into pieces, and they would etch in the alphabet. That's also a decent system to use. You could also use wood tiles, pieces of branch. That's what a lot of Germanic heathens use. They take a stick, cut it into the alphabet, and then burn in all the runes in it. I prefer dice because dice was more commonly used among both the Greeks and the Romans. And it's a very basic system. It's sort of like almost like a horoscope. Commonly, divination was done after ritual. I'm sure you're familiar with horoscopy, reading of entrails, especially, and reading of birds. Those are two common ones that you would see. The flight of birds over ritual would have some kind of significance. The Celts also did this. The Druids are actually written as doing this very commonly. But entrails was a specific one because in older times they would make animal sacrifices. But obviously using dice is a lot simpler, a lot cheaper, and a lot more straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
But they were also used for games. And there are games that have survived. There are dice games that literally look like archaic craps. Rolling it up against a wall, and there's a specific set of numbers you're supposed to get the thing. So people were commonly using dice for both purposes.
Thanks.
Sorry if I was a little verbose, but it's a very interesting subject to me. It's a correlation to some of my favorite subjects. Looks like it's getting windy out there. I hear my trash can outside moving around a little bit.
Same here.
So you like the version of your symbol that I made for you, Path? It works out okay?
Yeah, I changed it, so I don't know how long.
It usually takes about 24 hours to take hold on the Hangout, in my experience. But like you can see it on your profile. It's there. And every post that you've made since then, it will show up reflect with that symbol. So
Awesome.
the Hangout must be on a different server because it always takes. I've changed my profile picture. I'm actually thinking I might change it here in a little bit. But yeah, so just be patient and it'll come up.
I found amazing. My wife got my little nephew Skylander Wii game, where you put all these little images on the platform, and then it comes alive on the screen, and whatever powers you can go through the game and use and switch them out, and that blew my mind. I was like, man, these kids are buying packaged archetypes, that they can use in a gaming environment. I was like, that just totally. I was sitting there explaining the whole thing to the little kid, and he's just playing it, and he was just like, yeah, I was like, this is like psychology being worked. It's just amazing,
What were these things called?
It's the I think it's called the Skylander game for the Wii, and there's hundreds of these little images that you buy and put them on the transporter or whatever they call it. I don't know, and then it comes up on the screen, and they all have different characteristics of different things and how they can be used, and yeah, it's pretty amazing. I went crazy when I seen it because I was thinking, psychology and all that.
Huh.
Yeah, my son loves that. Yeah, Skylander game, so he's really into it too. And that's why I have to get the Wii because he really wants to play that game.
Frank, I watched a really interesting video, and I've seen a bunch to paraphrase. I've seen a bunch of Zikr videos, but I saw one that was really interesting, and it was from Chechnya. They ran in a circle, and I was wondering if there's prescribed.
Each order has their own prescribed Zikr.
And is it divided per order, or is it prescribed for more a national kind of idea?
It's usually for the order.
Iran, you would see something very different than if you went to Turkey, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'll post it in a second. So.
Yeah, Chechnya is big on Zikr. That's a country of Zikr. That's basically it's for Chechnyans. It's like their food. If you take away their Zikr, it's like you're making them starve. That's how much they're into Zikr. They're more fervent, but each order has their own Zikr contingent upon the person who started the order.
So it is at a base level is based off of nationality, but it's not necessarily dictated by such.
It's dictated by the founder of the order.
Right.
Yes.
And it just so happens, I guess the same thing in Judaism, it just so happens that that dictator of the order was from a particular area of the world, so that area of the world would reflect that, more so than other places.
Correct.
Right, okay. Yeah, it's the same thing for us, I guess.
Usually more the ones that from that area, from the Eastern Asian is Nashbandi. Is usually the designers that they call them. They're a very old order. The order that I belong particularly is probably newer, is from Rumi. And we have Zikr, but they're usually whirl. It's like the whirling dervishes.
That's more based in Turkey?
Yeah, more based in Turkey. Rumi was actually from Afghanistan, part of Persia at one time, but he moved to Turkey. And the area that he was in was part of Rome. It was a very Romanized area, and that's why they call him Rumi, meaning Rome.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. Yeah.
So his name was Muhammad al-Baq, meaning al-Baq is like an area in Afghanistan. They moved because of Mongol invaders, and he moved to Turkey, part of a Romanized area. So that's why they call him Rumi.
Yeah, I'm gonna post in the comments what I was talking about.
Yeah, Chutneys, yeah, they're big on Zikr. Yeah, it's amazing.
They're right in that Crimean area, so like they're right on the Black Sea, so that makes sense.
Yeah. And the cool thing about these Zikrs is that anybody can participate. Doesn't matter. So go in, go right ahead. Pretty funny. It's not like an exclusive thing.
Kevin, since we're off the subject, how often do your peeps get together to do something ritualistic? I guess, at least where you're living in America.
Well, last couple of years things have been rather busy for me, so I really haven't been able to make the time. I also live quite a bit further than I used to about 2 years ago, so it's been a sort of difficulty. I'm going to be moving a little bit closer, so I'll be about 45, 50 minutes away from the physical group that I belong to. I still keep in constant contact with a few of the members. They're a small group, so as most polytheistic pagans tend to be. So I'm hoping to go there for a few of the primary festivals that they've been hosting, maybe even help host one of them. There's a few I've been thinking about, like Dionysia Theastica, the Greater Dionysia I'd like to participate in. So probably a few times a year. Most of my spirituality is focused on household worship. So the new moon festivals, few sacred days throughout the lunar cycle that are of personal significance to myself, and sometimes some private observations of certain festivals of importance. So it's usually just a very sort of private thing for me. It's just because it's not as obviously as institutionalized, because it hasn't been practiced for 2,500 years. So yeah, that's kind of the gist of it.
Oh yeah, fair enough. Like, for lack of degree, like I guess I can't really like compare it myself to you. But like in my instance, I don't think I could raise my children in the country that I live in, just because there's no representation of our tradition here. So like there's things that are a lot closer than others here that like if I would have to live in my city, which would be the greatest city to raise my children in my tradition, there's definitely representation here. But if I want to actually have them be in a community, I'd have to either live in the States or definitely on the other side of the globe, in Europe or the Middle East or Africa or something like that. So it's definitely a struggle. Even though Jews are represented throughout, we're not all of the same denomination or the same theological, philosophical prescript, especially here in Canada where I'm living. So it's definitely a struggle.
Path, how much do you think, at least in your specific, what would you call it, denomination? I don't know.
Sect, I would say sect.
Sect, okay.
You know what I mean.
Yeah, like, what's the presence, if any, of kind of a meditation type of aspect or characteristic to the praying? Like, I know, or it seems to me like when you see, and I don't know if your sect does this when they visit the Kotel, like they do that. I think it's called davening, where they, you rock. Is there meant to be some like meditation style approach to those kinds of rituals? Not just that, but in general.
So I'll have to correct a few things. Davening is just Yiddish for the Hebrew word tefillah, prayer.
Oh, okay.
So when you say I'm davening, it just means I'm praying. We personally don't put much emphasis on the Kotel, on the Western Wall, and the Wailing Wall. So it's kind of complicated because there's historical reasons why the Western Wall, the Kotel, is significant, but the only reason is because historically, like within the last maybe since the Ottoman Empire at least, it was the closest place Jews can go to pray to where we're supposed to be praying.
Mm-hmm.
But within modern days, especially with the establishment of the state of Israel, we're supposed to be praying a lot closer. So it's the same thing with Muslims. Like we have a direction of prayer. So for Jews, like for me, I'm in Toronto. So Canada. So I pray southeast because I pray towards Jerusalem. I pray towards Israel. Sorry. So if you're outside of the land of Israel, to sensitive viewers, if you're outside of the Holy Land, you pray towards the Holy Land. If you're in the Holy Land, you pray towards Jerusalem. If you're in Jerusalem, you pray towards the Temple Mount. If you're on the Temple Mount itself, then you pray towards the Holy of Holies. So what happened is that Jews that were historically living in the land of Israel before the state of Israel existed, they were only allowed to pray in a certain area close to the Temple Mount. They weren't allowed to ascend to the Temple Mount and pray because that's where the Al-Aqsa Mosque was. That's where the Dome of the Rock was, like it is today. And not to go on a tangent, but even today, Jews aren't allowed to pray on the Temple Mount. Like if a Jew was to pray on the Temple Mount, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque was, and the Dome of the Rock, in that general area, if they were to pray, they'd get beat up by the Waqf, which was the Palestinian Authority, and then they'd be arrested by the Israeli police. So, we're not allowed to pray in our holiest site. So the reason why it's significant that the Kotel or the Western Wall is there is because that's the closest Jews can get to our holiest site to pray. So, which isn't even exactly correct. It's literally north of the Western Wall. There's tunnels. If you look on any picture, there's tunnels there where a lot of Jews pray because that's closer to where we're supposed to pray. But anyways, the concept of that is based off the idea of that we're supposed to pray in a central location because of unity of mankind, and it's stated in 1 Kings chapter 8 when Solomon dedicates the temple. And the same concept, we're supposed to pray there in that central location, not because there's intrinsic holiness, but because that intrinsic holiness was placed there in order that all mankind could focus on one central goal, if that makes sense. But I think I kind of lost your question in my explanation.
Yeah, I was just using that as an example of one particular ritual, not knowing if you personally practiced it in your sect or not. But my main thing was to what extent is meditation part of
I see what you're
ritual
saying.
In general?
The entire yeah.
Go ahead.
I was saying the entirety of prayer in itself is that concept.
Okay.
I think I can't even say I was a practitioner of a different religion, so I know what that teaches. before I became observant or orthodox in my native tradition. But the concept of that plays a heavy role. The concept of prayer is the idea of in the traditional Jewish, i.e. Torah or Tanakh or Talmudic-based sense, is a destruction of individuality. It's the idea of like you're praying towards God and you're acknowledging, because I guess I have to give some background. I think Muslims will understand this, whereas other religions might not. But the ideal form of prayer is in congregation. So
so not individual prayer.
no. So like 3 times a day, Jews pray like sunrise, afternoon, and sunset. Jews are supposed to pray in congregation with other Jews. You can on your individual, like that's completely acceptable, but like ideally in like what all Jews strive to is to do in congregation. The idea of like we're all submitting ourselves to the same source. The idea of like I'm no better than you are and you're no better than I am, etc., etc., etc. Like the kind of that kind of concept. So the idea of prayer is the idea of destruction of the ego, destruction of self, and submission towards a greater power. But that's not the end goal. The end goal is the idea of like we do those things in order that we might. I think I already said this in this hangout, but in order that we might able to build a level society. So like even though you might be worth more in capital than I am, or even more so that I might be a greater scholar than you are, but we're all required to be on this. We're all dependent on each other to pray with each other, because there's I guess say like a required amount of people that are required to pray at the same time. So we're required, like I'm dependent on you, like you're dependent on me, regardless of our societal status, in order to perform this action. And this action should be the highest requirement of the individual. So even though you might be the president or the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, now I might be a street sweeper, I'm dependent on you to make it to this meeting of prayer, and you're dependent on me to make this meeting of prayer. And the whole concept is that we're on the level playing ground in order to pray. And the concept of prayer is the destruction of one's ego and oneself in submission to I'm trying to think of a good English word to say this, but the unknowable or the unperceivable divine name, or the divinity of God. That's what we're here to do. So it's less to do about. So like the individual, as an individual prays, they're praying to God, but we pray in groups as a reflection to say that as groups we shouldn't be individualistic in our mission in life. So the individual has a mission to praise God, but as a group we don't have a mission to praise God. We have a mission to create a better society. We should move in unison. We all say the same words in prayer in unison. We all come together in unison. We all face the same direction in unison. So it has less to do about worshiping God. The individual worships God when he's praised, but when we come together as a group, it's more so the idea of like we should be together as one in order to be as one with humanity.
Gotcha.
It seems kind of like flowery and like hippie and all that stuff, but it's really like the concept of ourself. It's like it's rooted in the Bible and the concept of 1 Kings chapter 8, and in Daniel is the same way. It's the idea of like we face one direction, that is the Holy Land, or Jerusalem, or the Temple Mount, or the Holy of Holies, depending on where you are. We face that way not because intrinsically important, but because it is focusing the individual in a united aspect of humanity, that we're all facing one goal, we're all facing one direction, we're all kind of like focused on an intrinsic concept of what humanity should be focused upon, and that is worshiping God in the individual sense, but in the greater sense, it's being in unity with each other.
Interesting.
I definitely concur with that. It's basically almost the same concept here. You know,
What about in Hellenistic tradition, Kevin? Is there prayer, and what purpose does it serve?
Well, in Hellenic tradition, I hate to be a purist, but there's a difference.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
In Hellenic tradition now, prayer is integral. I mean, you can't not go without prayer. Anytime you worship the gods, you are honoring them, you are venerating them, you are saying prayers. The mindset of the Greeks and a lot of other Europeans is far less about submission. In probably all of the European traditions I could name to you, standing before the gods is a concept. You stand upright and pray before them. You may be seated when you're at home. You may be in a more subdued posture. But when you approach your altar, you approach it standing, with the arms outstretched, and you approach them in that manner. Because, and I wanted to mention this earlier, and I've mentioned this a few times before, but it bears repeating. The core concept to pretty much all ritual and sacrifice is charis, which is grace, basically. But what it really refers to is the reciprocity between man and gods. That we give of ourselves, and we strive towards personal excellence to cultivate virtue, so that we come to the gods. The gods do not come down to us. They don't make, house calls for us. That's not how that works at all. That idea, the gods do things for us personally. You see this in some neo-pagan traditions. It's completely hubristic. The idea of like a personal patron. Gods are patrons of places, things, aspects, domains, cities, countries, things like that, but not of individuals. We devote ourselves to them in the hopes that we can strive for much better, to become greater than we are. Not to become gods, but to become the best mortals that we can be in our lives. So, yeah, prayer is when you speak very frankly and honestly to the gods, not just about your concerns, but also talking about your life and where you'd like to go, listening to them and what they have to say to you, instead of barking commands. So that mindset is pretty classically understood through most ancient religions. It's not just something you heard from your Christian pastor that you should, when you were 5 or 6 years old, you shouldn't beg God for things. You shouldn't ask God for a freaking bicycle for Christmas. It's a mindset more than it is a sort of practice. These practices are meant to reflect your personal excellence. They're meant to reflect your path towards virtue and piety and self-reflection and honoring the gods and thanking them for what you've been provided.
Now, I may be mistaken, but wasn't there an aspect, at least in the ancient world, where it seems like maybe there was at least some importance on what the gods could do in your life? Maybe not for you necessarily, but, well, yeah, I guess for you. Like, there was no concept of that at all, like at least in the ancient world, as far as Hellenic traditions. Like, I'm not saying that would be the only reason you would be an adherent, but was there any aspect of, God's doing stuff in this life for you, like benefits, kind of perks of the religion? I mean, I know that sounds like perks. I know that sounds really, bad, but
Offensive, yeah.
yeah,
Well,
but you know what I mean, kind of, right?
no, yeah, I know, I get you. You have to understand that with polytheistic religion, as pretty much every religion that exists now, there are always going to be those people. I mean, I remember I went to a Buddhist temple a few years ago, and I saw some people that straight up looked like they came from work to be there for 5 minutes at the temple, and didn't really spend all that much time other than leaving an orange and lighting an incense, praying for 5 minutes, and they left. They didn't explore the grounds. They didn't go into the meditative part in the back and stay for a little while. There's always going to be people who are going to approach spirituality in the sort of aspect of, oh, I'm going to ask them for things. I want things. There's always going to be people like that. But in the beliefs that we have, and I can speak specifically from the Greeks, almost all of the Greek tragedies were about that problem. They were about people trying to seek far, far beyond the ken of their own understanding, trying to ask too much of themselves and too much of others, and not actually seeking out excellence, but rather living in self-delusion. So, yeah, you definitely have that. Honor, virtue, those sorts of things, piety were essential to, especially the European pagan faiths of the ancient world. So, and in fact, you probably would have been looked down upon if that's all you were doing, if that was your only reason for going to a temple, was just to ask for things. Temples needed to be supported. It wasn't. See, in the old world, it wasn't just a caste of people that were, say, hired to do this or that or whatever. In many communities, regular individuals would have been able to host rituals. They would have been elected amongst their community to host a specific festival or something like that, depending on what level of society they were in. Obviously, you're going to have people in lower caste or a lower class who would practice different rituals than, say, the aristocracy would in the main polis and the demos. But it was definitely the case that they wanted you to participate as much as you could. But the important thing to mention, I've mentioned before, the most important thing to a lot of these polytheistic faiths was household worship. Because not everyone can go to a festival. Not everyone had the time, money, and energy to participate in that. So it was very sacred. And many of the beliefs, many of the myths, many of the aspects of theology were built around the idea that the spirit of the home and the gods that protected it were of utmost importance to your general practice and keeping up with your house. There's actually a thing called the Ktesios, which is sacred to one of the versions of Zeus, his domestic form. And what you would do is you would take olive oil and water and various different things you would have in your pantry. Like you could put things, common equivalents would be like rice and lentils and beans and just random stuff you put in it. And you would create that at the beginning of the month, at the lunar cycle. And then you would keep that in your home as a sort of offering to Zeus and to the gods, and then at the end of the month you would sacrifice that at the crossroads to Hecate. So she would take all of the negative things out of your house. I mean, there was many different rituals that were like this. If you want any idea of how complicated it gets, look into the Agathos-daemon. The Agathos-daemon, the good spirit, is basically the domestic spirit of the household. And there's many different versions in other polytheistic faiths that's very similar to this.
Okay, that's interesting. Like, it's not surprising, like you said, that there's always going to be those people who are just kind of in it for the perks, like I said. But I wasn't sure if it was something that was built into the system or not, that you're not in that kind of base way, but more like you shouldn't be doing all these rituals and practicing this tradition because there are benefits, but you'll get the benefits if you approach it honestly. So there was no concept of anything like that.
There are linguistic concepts, things that we've been able to preserve and have been spoken about in certain writings that reflect that idea. I'm not sure exactly if they're as succinct as maybe you would find in a preserved world religion. Obviously, that's kind of the whole point of Reconstruction, is that it's a little on the sort of difficult side when it comes to actually making sense of it. But I can give you a brief sort of explanation. I've written a lot of this stuff out for just these sorts of occasions because, there's a lot of terminology that's a little specific. I mentioned charis, which is obviously the reciprocity of man and gods. Eusebia is ritual piety, which is when you approach ritual is different from ordinary consciousness. It's liminal consciousness. You're getting into a different state amongst the gods. I've mentioned this before. The gods aren't in. They're not one and the same as the idol. The idol itself is, just to use that as a term, is meant as a representation to help you get into that state. Ultimately, the gods are far greater than that. I've probably mentioned the idea of hospitality, xenia, which was integral to a lot of those sorts of things, especially in festivals, because not every single worshiper is necessarily from your community. So it was important to be welcoming to those people. And probably the most important thing, and you will see very, very similarly to other religions, like the similarities between like Greek religion and Shintoism are really strong. It's weird. There's something called kathamos, which is ritual purity. Maintaining it is a process called hagneia, and that's where most of the structures come in, where you see things that look like holy water, the heavy use of frankincense, the use of barley and the spreading of barley in an area that has been consecrated, aspect like that. And what you're fighting against is something called miasma, which is basically spiritual impurity. Miasmas are spoken about in many of the different folk tales, the myths, and in the tragedies. It could be the impurity of an individual, a place, or a thing. And it's always brought about through acts of hubris, which is excessive pride, arrogance, or outright blasphemy. A complete, not a refusal, a complete rejection of charis, of that grace, that reciprocity, that sacred relationship between man and gods. I hope that kind of gives you a more clear reason why the rituals were structured the way they were.
Yeah, it definitely does. Thank you.
Kevin, could you write out how charis would be spelled in English in the comments? Okay, thank you.
Sometimes, very rarely, I've seen people write it a little differently than that, but usually that's the Anglicization that you most commonly see. I'm trying to think here real quick. My knowledge is escaping me at the moment. Sometimes it's spelled with a CH.
Yeah.
A lot of the considerably more proper Anglicizations are usually using a K, because it's more represents how the actual it looks. But I'll show you what it looks like in Greek, so you know what you're looking for. There you go. Charis.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
And there's actually a group of spirits, Karikerites, the Graces, which I'm sure you're probably familiar with looking at Greek mythology. That's what they're associated with. Welcome, Clayton. Sorry, didn't say hello to you when you first came in. We were this very complicated kind of conversation about ritual. So.
Apology not accepted.
Oh, you make me sad.
Good, be sad. No, it was cool.
Damn. All right, then.
I was learning, so.
Cool.
Actually, I probably would like more information on the little, the house cleansing ritual that you were talking about.
Okay, I'll give you a little bit of sort of example. Okay, you're familiar with the idea of the new moon, right?
The what?
The new moon.
Oh yeah.
Our concept of the new moon in Western countries is a little offset from how it was in the Mediterranean and the Near East. Our new moon is actually like the dark moon. The new moon to most of Mediterranean cultures was actually the sign of the first crescent, which can vary depending on how the moon is and where you are. That celebration in Greek is literally New Moon Festival, Noumenia. And that's like the primary festival. You honor your household gods, the gods of place that protect you, like Hermes, for instance, Apollo, Zeus Kestios, and Zeus Melikos, kindly and of the home, and various others. Obviously, they can get into certain specifics. That day is sacred to Seguin, the goddess of the moon, as well, one of the Titanesses. The day before that, or days before that, leading into it, a day and a half, is the Hecate's Depnon, the feast of Hecate. And sometimes, usually most practitioners, it's a very simple sort of ritual. A lot of times you'll take some onions, leeks, garlic, like a hard-boiled egg, kind of stuff that you have lying around that's going bad, and you take that and you go to a crossroads. Like find a just open field where there's like crossroads. It's just open space way outside of your house. And you leave that as an offering. Often you can also say the hymn to Hecate. There's a section at the very end of Hymn to Museos, the first of the Orphic myths. There's a paragraph just dedicated to Hecate, and that's a really good one that many of us would use for that. I usually just leave her a small offering on my altar that day and say her hymn, thank her, and ask her to take some of the negative from the previous month away and help to ease the transition into the new month and the new responsibilities that that month takes. Noumenia is to celebrate the beginning of new things. A lot of times on Hecate's Depnon, you would clean your house. That's a really good thing to do. You would clean your fucking house. If there's anything you're just, this is fucking disgusting, why the hell did I leave this over here? Clean it. So you don't even have to have it as necessarily a festival, but it is good to have a meal with her too, to actually make it as a sort of feast to her. She's also one of the Titanesses, daughter of the goddess of the stars, basically.
And what's her name?
Hecate.
Hecate. Okay.
Sometimes she's called Hecate or Hecate in English, which always makes me want to strangle a bitch. But anyway, that happened. And who doesn't, right? And then the day after Noumenia, basically the second day of the lunar cycle, is literally called Agathos Daemon. It's the day of the good spirit, and you usually say his hymn, honor him, and it's really a time for personal reflection because Agathos Daemon is an incredibly complicated spirit. It's both often used as an epithet of Zeus and Hermes. It represents your higher self. It represents the spirit of the home and the spirit of your town and place of residence. It's very sort of complicated. It represents the goodness of spirit that exists in an area. And that's reflected in those rituals I was talking about with kathamos and ritual purity and keeping out miasma from yourself and from others. And there's a whole folklore behind that. I'm sure you're familiar with the evil eye. And I'm sure you've probably seen in the Middle East they have the the Hantafamesh, or the Hamsa, that hand symbol. That dates all the way back to Mesopotamia and ancient Canaan. They used it as a sort of ward against the evil eye, people sending bad juju to you, basically. Well, the Greeks had a similar symbol that they would often call the Eye of Aphrodite. You probably see it in Greek establishments. It's a big blue glass thing with a white and a smaller blue pendant. And a lot of times it'll be hanging, or it'll be a big one with a bunch of things hanging from it. Sometimes it'll actually be in that hand, because the two sort of folklores have kind of intermingled because of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, which have sort of taken it. And obviously many Muslims and Jews prefer not to use it because, well, it's kind of pagan. And many modern Canaanite polytheists used the kapu, the hand, as their symbol for their religion. So it's very, very complicated. But the point is that Mediterranean peoples in that whole area were very concerned with the idea of keeping that away from you, and that keeping yourself pure from those sorts of outside influences, from materials, from actual physical impurity and disease, but also spiritual impurity from people who seek to do you physical or emotional harm.
It's called the Eye of...
Sometimes the Eye of Aphrodite. Oftentimes it's not really called that, but you'll see it. Just look up, seriously, just look up Hamsa pendant, and you'll see those symbols. And a lot of times they'll have the eye in it, in the hand. That eye.
I recognize the symbol.
I had when I was living in Israel, or not to offend anybody, or Palestine, or whatever you want to call it. When I was living in Israel, I had a couple acquaintances who were practitioners of the Canaanite religion, and that was like, they would say that was their identifying symbol of their religion, like how Jews have like the menorah as their identifiable symbol of the religion, or Christians have like the cross. The practitioners of like the traditional Canaanite religion would have the hand with the eye on it, the Hamsa, as their standard, like, I guess, symbolism of their faith.
Yeah, kapu, kaf, hand, palm. The funny thing about that is how it's translated into English, because of how we've absorbed words from other foreign languages. That is completely intentional. The fact that palm and a fucking palm tree are the same thing is not a coincidence, because the symbol was often like this and not like this. If you look at it's stylized on purpose, and it looks very much like a palm tree. The reason for that is very much the association with that symbol was not just protection, but it was also fertility. The tree that offers of itself, that gives of itself freely. And there's a lot of trappings to that and symbolism inherent to that. Various different goddesses to which the palm tree is sacred. Astarte was a perfect example, the sort of Semitic Aphrodite. Hence why it was called the Eye of Aphrodite, because it was the two were so commonly linked. In fact, the cult of Aphrodite was so interlinked that when the Greeks would go to Phoenicia, it was viewed as so much the same thing. Welcome back, Path. I was just describing that the kapu symbol is both a hand and a palm tree, and it's because it's associated with fertility and Astarte and Aphrodite and goddesses of fertility and all that sort of thing. There's very much that sort of trapping. It was very much in keeping with the ancient view that fertility is pure.
Yeah.
Pure and without corruption.
I was wondering where like the symbol like originated from, because like in Islam you have it, they call it the hand of Fatima, and a lot of like very mystical, and a lot of mystical Judaic sects, they call it the hand of Miriam, I believe. I could be wrong on that, but like the Hadassah, it's in itself, because Hadash is 5, like the 5 fingers kind of idea. So, but you see it throughout the entirety of North Africa. You see it in the Middle East. You see it in the Arabia. You see it in the Mediterranean. You see it also in East Africa. So I was wondering, like, what like really the key was. So like in my faith, not my faith, but like my sect, we don't use that symbol just because it's from like a primordial aspect, not native to our particular belief system. But I was very curious about what the actual symbol means, because we have like entire cultures, like I was saying, North Africa, East Africa, Middle East, Arabia, and the Mediterranean, who interpret it in their own faith tradition.
If you look at the Proto-Canaanite pictographs, the earliest form of writing that they had for those, they're basically their alphabet. Kaf was actually a hand. It looks like two lines here on the outside, and then two lines in here for the fingers. It's a hand.
Yeah.
So it was a symbol that they would have commonly used, and I'm sure that there's all sorts of cultural specific trappings to that that you would see with how they viewed the hand. I mean, you know probably better than I do because of the meanings that are inherent to each of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So that is my honest guess is probably where a lot of that stuff comes from, is cultural specific kind of meanings of symbols that are tied into language.
So here's a better example about it, but what about the eye that's usually associated within the palm of the hand? In the Greco tradition, is there a concept of there being like symbolism with the eye, necessarily, not in relation to the hamsa, the hand eye, but like just the eye in itself?
Well, like I said, there is the evil eye, which is a common sort of thing, and it is once again sort of associated largely with Aphrodite because, like many fertility goddesses of her type, she wasn't just fickle. She was my friend. She was a bitch. I mean, I worship her, but the way she's described in the myth, she's described as a woman you don't fuck with. So there's a sort of view that is inherent to that be careful where you tread, you know, especially with women because, well, you know, women are that women. But what were you going to say?
Oh, I was saying women are women, so yeah.
Exactly. I'm trying to think of the term for it. Okay, yeah, the evil eye is known as mati, eye, in the Greek. But largely that is more associated with folk tradition than it is actually the religion. So it's one of those things that's difficult to kind of place because they didn't really write a whole lot about it. I mean, it was mentioned briefly in certain writings, but not in any sort of detail. If that makes sense?
No, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, for sure. I was thinking because in Hebrew we have two different alphabets, an ancient script and a modern script. In our ancient script, the term, like in Hebrew, the phrase, not the phrase, the phrase for I is ayin, A-Y-I-N.
Yeah, ayin.
Yeah, in ancient script it's a circle, so you can see how it would be an eye. In modern script it's not as
in the pictographs, it was an ellipse with a semicircle inside, literally with the actual shape of the
Oh,
iris.
very interesting. Yeah.
The same concept in Arabic to ayin.
Right. Yeah. Ayin is very much the same. The letters for Semitic languages, but in the two Hebrew scripts, in the oldest Hebrew script, it was like a complete circle. Very because like we had like a very like it wasn't pictorial because we evolved out of the Canaan, the Proto-Canaan or the Proto-Sinaitic script.
Yeah, and eventually Proto-Semitic, which is
Exactly.
earlier than both of them.
Exactly. So like, I have a big issue with people saying like this is like ancient Hebrew script, and they're showing me like Proto-Sinaitic or Proto. You know, it seems like it's a very big issue for me because I'm like, I know what Hebrew script is, I know what like modern Hebrew script is. They're very different, like because we use it in a very particular period of time. But I could go on a tangent. But
Interesting.
Yeah, sorry.
Interesting little correspondence when you look at how Phoenician and to a certain extent Hebrew were correlated to the formation of the Greek alphabet.
Yeah, same thing. Yeah, it's very rooted in the same.
Ayin is very commonly rooted with Omicron, which is just an O. It's the little O.
Oh, it's very interesting. Yeah, because written the exact same way in ancient Hebrew.
Yep. Yep. So very similar. Aleph, Alpha, Bet, Beta, Gimel, Gamma, Daleth, Delta, He, Epsilon, right? And then the Wav was technically used early. Zeta is Zayin, Heth is Eta, Teth is Theta. I mean, it just goes on and on. They're very, very, very similar.
And Aleph is just an alpha on its side kind of idea.
Yeah, exactly. That's how it developed.
Kind of switch it. Yeah, exactly.
Because they wanted to designate themselves as different. That's what people do.
Oh, of course, yeah. Their distinct culture.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, Greek went through a lot of evolution. There are a lot of letters that are no longer used. They weren't even used in the classical period. So, in the archaic period, they were used. But we don't have a whole lot of information about archaic period Greek.
Is there any relation between the Greek alphabet and the Copt and what the Copts use? The Coptic.
There are shared letters, yes.
Shared letters, not the sounds. Like they just co-opted them or something like that.
Yeah, the formation of Coptic was largely through their interaction with the Greeks and the Romans. So
they had their own. I could be wrong, but they had their own sounds based off their tradition, but they utilized the script based off the Greco-Roman tradition.
Well, what people don't understand is that there were two forms of writing that were used in Egypt. The pictographs were used largely for religious purposes, but they had an administrative text that they would use. And that eventually developed later on and became what Coptic is now. I mean, and it's ironic because that is now a liturgical language. So.
So at the same time there were the hieroglyphics, they had a different script that they used also?
Yeah, so the hieroglyphs are called the Metaneter. That would be like the Vine script. It would be like pictographs, like Kevin was saying. The Metaneter is like only the elites would understand what was written on the walls. They were intrinsically, every symbol was had its own meaning and its own depth. You have to be trained in understanding what it meant. But there was like a layman script that would be like what we would call like
a consonant-based alphabet style.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
What we commonly see.
Begins with a D. I'm sorry, I don't remember the word.
Demotic. You were right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Demonic. Yeah.
Demonic.
Demotic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the Greeks used it a lot in the Hellenistic period in the development of a lot of their mystery traditions, especially Hermeticism. It was very, very common to be used.
They use that alphabet or that script?
That script, yeah.
Interesting.
I'll get you a link. I know a lot of alphabet language links that are pretty good.
Thanks. Yeah. So like literally the Medu Neter in ancient Egyptian means like the divine language, like the language of the gods.
Well, Neter is the name for their gods.
Right.
It's
So like Medu is like the language, and Neter is a god. So like the language of the gods, and then you would have like the common script, which would be which would be the sorry, I have a cat on me. Sorry.
Here's a basic one, real basic. It's from Omniglot, which is a pretty decent site. This shows you, if you scroll down, you'll see some script, real basic, and that's a description. There's a lot of work on it. We don't know a whole heck of a lot, but you'll notice that it's pretty phonetic. It's very much like a lot of the Semitic languages. There's a lot of redundant symbols. That's because they had specific kind of things. You'll notice diacritics on the tops and bottoms of certain letters. It's because there's specific pronunciations. Egyptian is a really unique language. There's a lot of whenever you see like a curve mark over an S, it usually means it's an SH sound.
It looks like it has a lot of similarities to Arabic.
Yeah.
The style of the letters. A lot of the letters.
I would say it's the kind of opposite because Arabic. I would say the Arabic script root comes out of the Syriac script, and the Syriac script comes out of the Egyptian script.
Yep, exactly. It was through interaction with the early Semitic peoples and the Egyptians that helped to produce the Arabic script. They developed it.
Okay, so that's the connection then, yeah.
Yep.
I'll post.
Yeah, I didn't mean that this was based off of Arabic. That's not what I meant. I just meant that some of the symbols look similar.
Like, an interesting thing, the Phoenicians, for the longest time, when they were what we would call Canaanites, and just use that sort of vernacular, they used a sort of alphabet that was based in hieroglyphics. Not hieroglyphics, in cuneiform. Yeah. It looks. The Ugaritic script, the earliest forms of it, was less like an alphabet with particular shapes and was collections of cuneiform symbols. I'd be able to find it for you. It's actually pretty cool. That's what a lot of some of those people you were mentioning before, a lot of the Canaanite polytheists, they use it. They use that as their script. They sometimes use both.
Cuneiform?
Yeah, like a version of it. Maybe not like literally writing it down, but they definitely try to use it in digital form at the very least, or write it with a pen. You can write cuneiform with a pencil. It's not as.
Yeah, for sure. I always find it interesting because like I would assume they would make a differentiation between the Canaanites versus Sumerian or Mesopotamian cultures. I don't know.
Well, you have to understand that the Ugaritic cuneiform is much more simple. It's only hold on. What's 6 times 30? There's about 30 letters. Assyrian, the Assyro-Babylonian script has like 60 or something stupid. I'll show you. Here's Ugaritic script from ancientscripts.com. It's a real good one. And I'll find.
What's the historical connection between cuneiform and the Ugaritic script? I mean,
right. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to understand.
The Mesopotamians were using cuneiform. The Sumerians, which are much older culture, were using cuneiform. And
so the Sumerians, you're saying, are before the.
It was before all of it.
Before the canon.
They were the definition of the Middle Eastern prototypes.
Okay, so they're like the root of that.
Yeah, for sure, no doubt.
Okay.
At least as far as cultural and societal structure.
Yeah, outside of Africa, that's for sure.
Yeah. And then the Assyrian and Babylonian cultures, and the ones that preceded slightly before that, they adopted Sumerian culture, language, and societal structures. The Sumerians are a non-European non-Semitic culture that we're not entirely sure where they come from. There's all kinds of theories as to who exactly the Sumerians were. It's likely that they came from an earlier culture that was much further east, that coexisted with various Asiatic, Turkic, and Indo-European cultures, but we're not sure where the connection actually is. So,
now, do we know of any written script from the ancient Near East that predates cuneiform?
That's difficult. That's really difficult. There's suggestions of pictographic languages, but nothing concrete.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the idea of like we could say what we want, but the idea of like as far as having
a systematic alphabet.
Systematic root always goes back to cuneiform, and it depends how you define what the Near East is. That's a really big concept. Are we going to define the Near East as far as Asia versus Africa? Or are we going to use the Sinaitic level as being the bridge between the two? Because then we can make a very big definition between the two. But if we're going to define as Africa as we know it today versus Asia as we know it today, then we could say that the Cuneic is the first written script we know in that the Asian plateau, being the Near Eastern, Middle Eastern, and the Far Eastern scripts.
They didn't have a lot of paper. They didn't have a lot of paper, so they used clay tablets.
They used clay tablets. Exactly, so that's the kinds of concepts. But if you want to break down borders, you want to say that the idea between Africa and Asia is like seamless, it's kind of hard to tell because we're just using our own modern mind frame to define these borders. So
yeah, I just posted a link to Akkadian, and that's simple compared to Sumerian.
Yeah.
It is both a syllabary language using combinations of each consonant and vowel. It also uses lograms and determinatives. Like, for instance, if I was to write the name of Anum, I would write An and then Anu, which would be basically name of God, God. So like the dingir symbol that the Sumerians used was transferred and turned, instead of a star symbol, it became a cross. And it basically just means God. So when you would write, you would use the logram An and then say Anu or Marduk or Ishtar. It would be An Ishtar, God of Ishtar. So that was very common that they would do that. It's very, very, very interesting how they did a lot of stuff like that. And Sumerian is even more complicated. It's just freaking ridiculous. It's a very interesting area of study, but you have to be pretty hardcore.
yeah, hardcore, but you have to like really delve into like maybe like 4 to 6 different languages, scripts, just to understand like the evolution and what they might. The basis behind them.
Yeah, and Doug, you were mentioning before about the Canaanites and the Phoenicians.
I was wondering, like, does Phoenician have connections with early African scripts, or is it also basically come from cuneiform ultimately?
It comes out of another script that was being developed at the same time. The Proto-Semitic scripts and the Proto-Canaanite scripts that developed out of that, and they did both. Because the Sumerian culture and the Assyrian Babylonian culture that came out of that was so immense. I mean, it was largely the ruling power in the area. So many of the cultures, as Reuven was great to mention, the Elebites, the Elamites, the Hittites, who were a European culture, Luluians, the Hattic and Hurrian cultures, and the Urartian languages, and the old Persian alphabets were all inspired by that. But you have to understand, common people were also writing stuff, and they were interacting. So likely through their interaction with Egypt, who had ways of writing that didn't involve this very involved kind of clay tablet thing that they developed. That's also why Demotica developed, because common folk, or people not necessarily in the ruling class or in the priestly class, were developing writing systems. And they eventually came to power later on through interactions with these people. Obviously, the Phoenicians were coexistent with the Greeks. You can see kind of where it's just a gradual development of language.
That's interesting. I've always loved like the cuneiform script. But it makes sense that the way it looks too, because you said you guys were saying it's mainly clay tablets. Well, that would be a somewhat simple alphabet to write on clay tablets. There's not a lot of curves, curvy letters.
It's made with a stylus.
Yeah, it's like a triangular kind of I guess we would say like a pencil or something like that.
It's a stick. It's a little stick that they cut off the end at a 45-degree angle. It
Exactly.
makes a little triangle on the end, and you press down, and you let it dry. Usually the clay tablets were stored in a cool, dark place, and they would be formed that way, and then they would be transported, largely in boxes or secured places, and they would be sent off by couriers from place to place. So imagine, and it's not email. This took a long time to get a message from one place to another.
Yeah.
And what happens if it breaks? You have to rewrite the tablet.
Yep. You're screwed.
And a lot of our writings from ancient Samaria were found randomly in like the 20s. In the desert.
That's the thing, yeah.
You dug up a bunch in some riverbed, right? Like just thousands of clay tablets. A lot of them were like trade records and stuff like that, didn't they?
Yeah. You think that you might think that my spiritual path is a little out there. I know people who practice Sumerian polytheism.
Wow.
Yeah.
Or what we know of it.
Yeah. It's interesting stuff. We know a little bit more about the Canaanites and the Babylonians and the Syrians.
Oh, really? I would have figured it would have been the other way around.
No,
It's about Samaria.
It's kind of like how the Romans preserved a lot of the Greek stuff. A lot of our concepts of Greek myths are actually kind of Roman, and that because they were studying the Greeks a lot, and they kept it going. And that's why you had Emperor Julian, who existed in the very late Hellenistic period, who was trying to preserve Greek religion. That's where we get the term Hellenismos from, basically Hellenic religion, and that's the common word that I use for my tradition, largely because of Romans. It was the same thing with Babylon and Assyria, that they were kind of like the children of Samaria, and they were preserving a lot of those sorts of myths. Their gods were very, very similar.
I was going to say, you just have to look at the Rosetta Stone to understand the significance. The Rosetta Stone is in the Meta-Neter, the hieroglyphs, and it's in the Mnemonic, and it's also in the ancient Greek to understand the transition periods between the languages. And the only reason why the Rosetta Stone is because that's what decode
allowed us to translate all that.
Yeah, exactly. No. The only thing that translated was the hieroglyphics. So we had, I would say, we really knew what the Greeks were. We knew the Greek language. The Dominic, we could say the Copts already knew. It could be argued because the Copts language is now and then a little bit different, but we can understand it. But the Meta-Neter, the hieroglyphs were well known, were completely unknown. So that's what we use a Rosetta Stone form to understand what the ancient Egyptians hieroglyphs, that's the word I'm trying to say, the hieroglyphs were saying.
Yeah.
So it's written in those three languages.
You guys still there?
I'm here.
Oh, okay. Got all really quiet all of a sudden.
Oh, I got a cool avatar now. Thanks, Kevin.
Now, were the ancient Sumerians basically, since they are in the same region, like ethnically, are they pretty much what today we call Arabs?
No,
Oh, really?
no. So this is why it's very difficult about Arabs, because if you talk to an Arab, every Arab would say we're all Arabs, but ethnically, Arabs aren't all the same people. Culturally and linguistically, they're the same people, but ethnically, they're not the same people.
Even early on, they weren't the same people. There were
That's
many
why it's
different
difficult.
tribes in Arabia.
Exactly.
We call Arabia.
Pre-Islam, they're not the same people, but you have like people from Iraq all the way to Morocco, down south to Yemen, up north to Lebanon. They're all saying they're Arabs, but they're not the same people. They just speak the same language and have the same religion.
It's the same thing with the Spanish.
Oh, the
in
Right, like
America.
Hispanic people saying they're Spanish. It's not the same thing as like
Oh.
Spaniards.
Yeah. So-
Even
Well-
the Spanish from Spain are so incredibly mixed. Like,
Yes.
it's not even funny.
Like I'm come from the area of Andalusia. We're definitely different from people from Catalonia and Barcelona.
Exactly.
We're different.
Celtiberian, Basque,
Yeah, the Basque.
Catholic, Germanic, Moorish. Yeah, lots
Exactly.
of stuff going on. Same with the French.
They're very, and Iberia is very mixed.
It's only a political little mind sphere that says that there's an Arab world. There's an Arab-speaking world, but ethnically they're not the same people. That's for sure.
Now,
It's just language.
are the ancient Sumerians basically an extinct race of people, or what? Like, what's their closest analog to today's ethnic division?
I would say Assyrians. Assyrians are the only living people I would say are
Yes.
close to.
They
Sumerian.
stuck a lot closer to the earlier Semitic group, both culturally and ethnically. The Assyrians really picked up a lot of the Sumerian bloodline genetically, and just so much else. But Babylon came into power, and largely that's what we see today in a lot of the Middle East is the Babylonian influence. But Assyria, definitely.
Assyrians. If you meet any Assyrians, they're probably like the closest you can get to Sumerians. They're like the oldest cultural group that you can get in that region. That's for sure.
Now, what population ended up populating what used to be populated by these Assyrians or Sumerians? Like, where did what we would today call Arabs?
Well, first the Persians, and then the Arabs. Pretty much.
What's like the ethnic root of Arabs?
Between the Persian and the Arabs, you had the Macedonians as well. Yeah, you had Alexander conquer that region as well. So right in between, I wouldn't say they're Macedonians, but I'm saying like between the Persians and between the Arabs, you still had that complete conquering of that region of the Greeks. So they weren't Greeks, but I mean like they had a policy of mixing of the people in that sense. So
yeah,
they weren't Greeks, obviously. They weren't Macedonians, but I mean like they weren't necessarily Persians. They weren't Arabs, but there was like this in-between period of just conquering. So
the Fertile Crescent is incredibly mixed.
Yeah, exactly.
Sounds like it.
If you want to call the Mediterranean their own race, I'm for it.
Yeah, it's like ridiculous to like say like this entire region is one people.
Yeah, exactly. I always
It's like North America when you say I know like I was talking with somebody when I was living in the Middle East when I was talking with an American about when I was living in Canada because we're very much educated like the area we live we understand like the Native American cultures that bordered each other pre the French colonies kind of idea and then even more so pre the English colonies And it's the idea of like, okay, so nowadays we could say like, oh, Native Americans lived throughout the entirety of North America and South America, but they in themselves are in distinct nations. So like personally, I live in Cree Nation versus living in a Black Hawk Nation or versus living in a Mohawk Nation or something like that. So like we could say they're all one people being other Native Americans, but they're distinct nations in themselves. But it's how much more so is it in a place that was predated them like 1,000 years, like such as the Middle East, Mediterranean, North Africa. The same concept, Asia. We want to paint it in this like very broad sense, but it's intrinsically complex.
I think though that those broad categories have their uses. I mean, you can divide classification up into a bunch of different levels with more and more specificity as you get more atomistic in your classifications. But I think different levels have their appropriate uses. I mean, even if like you're saying, you could say Europeans. Well, that word alone doesn't by itself reflect the diversity of that's
right
present in Europe, but it's still a term that you can use as a shorthand for saying basically all the people who live in Europe or descended populations in Europe. But yeah, I mean, you could really get super atomistic and go down to like different types of New Yorkers. I mean, as far as you want to go.
You're right. Yeah. What borough are you from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or same with England. I mean, look at all the different, I wouldn't say dialects necessarily, but different, majorly different accents in a very confined geological space.
Like where I'm at, there's a difference between North Jersey and South Jersey. Clear distinction. Like I could tell right away, like, oh, you're from South Jersey. And they could tell I'm from North.
Sorry, I meant geographical, not geological.
Well, yeah, it's crazy, like how, New Jersey is such a new state, but yet we already have like a culture between North and South. Like, that's weird.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can divide people up at every level you want, from all the way up from we're all humans down to you're this one individual, and there's every level in between those two extremes.
Yeah. So.
The same problem is in biological classification. Like, there aren't usually clear lines that work in every case. There are blurry edges, blurry boundaries with any kind of classification you're gonna use. But that doesn't mean that the classification isn't useful.
No, there's definitely useful classification. By definition, there shouldn't be blurry lines. Like, that makes no logical sense. There's like a definition line between an African versus a European, or an Asian versus an American kind of idea. Like, by definition, that shouldn't exist because the species is the same. We could say there's a definitely clear line driven between a bear and a human being, but as far as like geographical location, it's different.
I don't know if you can. I mean, you can say they don't breed. Obviously, they can't produce fertile offspring. But
or like, okay, fine, like mammals, maybe you can't make the distinction. But I mean,
I don't know. I think even especially when it comes to biological classifications, even up to the level of kingdoms, you're going to get blurred edges. That they're going to be exceptions to the rule, no matter how carefully you try and define things. But I see what you mean. Obviously.
Okay, so I replace bear with bacteria.
Yeah, I just don't think it matters which example you use. I mean, you're always going to get some amount of.
Like everything comes from one base. Like I guess pinpoint.
Just like with humans, yeah.
Yeah. All life forms on Earth comes from one. More or less, could be argued. All life forms on Earth comes from one.
A single common ancestor.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or it looks that way.
As far as we know, I guess.
Yeah. But yeah, there's actually, I think there's some kind of logical fallacy based on that, like continuum fallacy or something like that. Like one of the common things is, well, like I'll just use the example of the United States. At 18, you're an adult. So the day before your birthday, in your 17th year, you're a child technically in the eyes of the law, or a juvenile, or whatever. You're not an adult. But then at the stroke of midnight, you become an adult all of a sudden, and it doesn't actually have any. I mean, nothing actually changed, in reality. But because there's just a smooth gradient, a continuum of change all the way from being a baby to an adult, there's no single point where you could say, okay, now you're an adult. Okay, that doesn't matter because we can't, that for legal reasons we have to specify a particular point, even though it's not biologically meaningful, but it's legally meaningful. And the same thing applies to classifications when it comes to ethnicities or even outside of humans, like specifying species or kingdoms or genus or whatever. Same thing applies. It might not have a biological reality that's without exception, but we have to do it to be able to talk about these things.
Of course, yeah. At some point, you have to make the distinction just to foster the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, you have to do that. Yeah. Humans just, it seems like we have to categorize things to make sense of the world.
I blame the Greeks.
Yeah, no, that's one thing where there's a theory in biology that one of the things that held back the idea of evolution for a long time was like Aristotelian, what is it called? Ideal types, I think. Like a rabbit is. The rabbits you see hopping around on Earth are, there's all different varieties. They're all different. There's a variation between them all, but they're all just like imperfect reflections of the ideal rabbit that's, in conceptual space, not in reality. And
there's a good reason for that. If you look at the history of Greek philosophy and how it ties into the Hellenistic period and eventually Christianity. It's a funny little thing with Christianity in that it was so heavily influenced by Plato and hasn't realized how heavily influenced it was by Plato. And it's obviously the same case with a lot of Islam to a certain extent. But because Platonism was so easily associated with Gnosticism by the Orthodox Christian Church, anything that wasn't Plato was favored in Greek philosophy and became more and more favored as they went through like revivals of Greek studies and things like that, studying Latin and Greek in schools and stuff like that among the aristocracy and in universities and such like that. So they favored Aristotle with his very rigid, very ordered sort of universe under the control of a sort of god, aspect, as opposed to the more evolutionary and more mystical and cyclical universe that Plato represented and the later Neoplatonists also sort of mentioned, which it's implicit that there's evolution, because it was like that with Pythagoras as well, because I mean many of them saw that human evolution was something that exists spiritually. I'm not saying that this is the only reason, but belief systems that are open to some form of spiritual evolution or mysticism, whether that's reincarnation or something of the sort, tend to be a little bit more open to the idea that we are connected to everything else. Whereas the Christian concept, as it developed, was so less Gnostic that it is, and I've made this sort of point a few times before, that a lot of Christianity is a sort of theistic materialism. You have this God that exists out here, disconnected from the world that he created, and creation, boom, it's created, it is how it is, it's perfect in every single way. It's man that fucked up.
Yeah. By the way, I got that mixed up. I meant to say the Platonic notion of ideal abstract objects. That I didn't mean Aristotle. That they're contrasted there.
But Aristotelian philosophy was favored by a lot of the Christian theologians and religious philosophers. So if you're trying to say the realm of forms and all that, I don't think that the comparison is all that valid, considering the fact that it was very emanacious, that it ultimately believes that it all comes from the same thing, the good.
In the
Even
Platonic
Plato,
idealism?
yeah, even in early Plato, his idea was that everything, there was a realm of forms, but ultimately they all came from the good, which was the highest existence
But
that
weren't
you could philosophically ascertain. It was the logos.
But weren't these ideal forms, like, in some sense inviolable, as far as like there was a perfect ideal form of something, and then there was the real world incident of it, or accident, whatever you call it.
But correlating the two, saying that the rabbit that I see is the perfect form of the rabbit,
no.
It's a fallacy.
Yeah, that's not what I mean to say. I mean, the rabbit we're seeing is but the imperfect reflection of that ideal, conceptual rabbit.
That's what I was thinking too. Yeah.
That makes sense. You could definitely make that argument.
And so the thinking goes, because those categories were there with those strict boundaries there, it kind of shunted off the notion that these things actually weren't completely separated categories, that they actually stem from a common thing. But now you're saying, I didn't know about that. So in Platonic idealism or realism, whatever, that they actually all stem from a single point.
Yeah, and that's what the later Neoplatonists developed later on. It's especially true of Plotinus, and a little less so with Iamblichus. He takes it in a very sort of Gnostic, Hermetic kind of direction. But the one, To'en, is the highest kind of goodness. I mean, they go through more of an effort to sort of mythologize the one, make it into a sort of being, in a certain sense, as something beyond being. But that was present in Pythagoras with this idea of the monad, and obviously in early Orphic religion with their concepts of sort of oneness before everything, the sort of eros.
Mm-hmm.
So you see that within Greek thought for a long time. And I mentioned the sort of mysticism and how that ties in because the Greeks sometimes believed in reincarnation, though they tended to favor more of the Hindu conception of it, of a transmigration, that people would reincarnate into another human. But that almost implies that human existence is a higher spiritual state, and that there have to invariably be lower spiritual states that exist. So,
I was trying to understand the concept of transmigration of the soul. At what point does it like what's the lowest form of transmigration then?
That I don't know.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Like is a plant or like a dirt or rock? Like when does it stop as far as like? Because I like as far as like a reincarnation, I understand like how you can progress outside of human where you have like consciousness and like nowadays you can understand like you could be an animal and you have consciousness, but at some point you gotta like stop having consciousness if you're going keep on digressing, and you can't like progress towards a higher state.
Sure.
There's got to be some point of cutoff. So I don't know, but I don't know.
Yeah. Once again, I'm not a person who really favors reincarnation. In
Yeah, for sure. I understand. I was just.
Yeah. There's a lot of other ideas that are more consistent with the Greek concept of spiritual evolution. Do I think it's possible in a spiritual sense, just looking at it that way? Yeah, sure. Do I think it's the rule? Probably not. I mean, I think if there is some sort of form, it'll probably likely be a sort of exception to the rule, or within families. But that's more consistent with how a lot of other cultures viewed it. A lot of African cultures believe that people could reincarnate within the family. The Celts also thought that. But it wasn't like a commonly held belief that was institutionalized in the way that it was with Hinduism and Buddhism. But it does reflect a certain idea of a connectedness between man and beast, that ultimately we're a part of the same thing, and a sort of respect for nature. And I know that does sound a little hippy-dippy, you know, it sounds like
versus theological.
Yeah, but that's only in a sort of response to the sort of, like I said, theistic materialism that we've seen with very fundamentalist forms of Christianity, and obviously people who go to something else, either an Eastern belief or a pagan belief or any other belief that's not Christian, and they see it in contrast, and that it's a sort of it's more animistic, it's more appreciative of the forces and cycles of nature. So it's really strange how Christians interpreted older ideas, especially the Greeks and the Romans, like the various different philosophies. Mm-hmm. I know that a lot of people at that time period appreciated the Stoics a lot more than they did some of the other philosophies. They felt that their sort of emotional restriction was very much in line with sort of their Christian ideal, sort of like Christianity outside of Christianity. And we've talked about this before, I'm sure, Path, that you had mentioned that Stoicism is actually kind of an interesting thing, and and I had mentioned that there were Jewish people who actually appreciated Stoic philosophy. So.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in the time of the Rishonim, which were like the medieval period of Jewish Jewish I don't know, theologians or whatever you want to call them. They often they would say that that the Greco like not even the Greco philosophers, but mainly the Platonists were very close to the concept of prophecy. Like I mean, people like Yehuda Navi, Maimonides, Ibn Ezra, they'd all say they're like the Greco philosophers of the Platonic era were very on the edge of prophecy, on their understanding of what the universe, how the universe acted, and the intrinsicies thereof. So, yeah, for sure. Okay, I gotta go. Be well, everybody. Be well, Reuven, Kevin, Sufi, and Doug. Everybody be well. I hope to see you next week. God bless. Nothing but good things.
See you, Path. Have a good one.
Take care.
Shalom, shalom.
Shalom.
Any other topics?
I mean, I have a few ideas floating around in my head that might be interesting for conversation.
Did you see this great chain of being thing I posted there?
What is that from?
I forget when it originally was developed, but it's kind of ranking the categories of beings, essentially, or of things.
There was a lot of that going on.
Originated from Greek philosophy, actually. But this particular one is like a probably Middle Age one because it has the seraphim and angels and all that.
Sure.
But
well, they were doing that even in late Neoplatonism with Iamblichus.
Yeah.
I mean, he had a very sophisticated kind of cosmology that included various different spirits and lesser spirits. It wasn't as common back in the day, with at least with the ancient Greeks, but it was definitely implied. It was definitely implied that there was a sort of breakdown that men were not beasts and there were different kinds of beasts. But that, I think, has a lot more to do with the time that they were living in, their understanding of science, than less how it does to anything necessarily integral to the spirituality. It's a common thing I sort of try to explain to people when we're looking at the reforming and progression of modern spiritual beliefs, whether ancient or modern or postmodern or whatever. That we have to look at what are the most important things of those faiths to take with us as doctrinal, and what are things that are just kind of up to interpretation.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to own a slave. They had them in Greece. But I don't think I'm going to own a slave. I don't think there needs to be specific castes of prostitutes either. So, little things like this, little finer details of ancient Greece, I don't think I need to bring into my spirituality. But, the Westboro Baptist Church doesn't seem to think so.
Well, I think there's culture and then there's religion.
Yeah.
And I think they don't always evolve together.
No.
But then again, they do. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely.
They're each informing each other.
There's a definition that Jung actually gives for religion, and I tend to agree a little bit with this.
Yeah, I'd like to hear it.
A subjective relationship to certain metaphysicals, extramundane factors, a kind of experience according the highest value regardless of its contents. The essence is the person's relationship to God or salvation. Jung called them psychotherapeutic systems and believed that they offered a gradient for and transform instinctual, non-personal energies, giving people a cultural counterpole to a blind instinct, help through difficult transitional stages, and a sense of meaning. They also separate the growing person from his parents. For Jung, the unconscious had a religious function, and religion rests on his instinctive basis, different from creeds, which are codified and dogmatized versions of religious experiences. Creeds usually say that they have the truth and they are a collective belief. For Jung, no contradiction existed between faith and knowledge because science has nothing to say about metaphysical events, and beliefs are psychological facts that need no proof. This is how basically he described religion.
That sounds similar to, well, put in more philosophical terms, obviously, but it sounds somewhat similar to, what was, I'm looking up the guy's name. I forget. Yeah, Stephen Jay Gould developed this thing called non-overlapping magisteria. So the realm of religion and science are separate domains, and they don't overlap at all, which sounded similar to what at the end of what you quoted from. I forgot his name already. Who are you quoting from?
Oh, Jung.
Yeah, Jung, Carl Jung. Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounded similar to Gould's idea of the non-overlapping magisterium or magisteria.
Yeah, he later talks about archetypes and traditional forms. Religions can collect like very parental images, connecting to the roots of centuries, traditional forms, and when they break or the images are lost, the energy activities activates the unconscious dangerously isms, and the state then replace tradition and hierarchical, I can't even say it, orders. They usually, what he's saying, and this is something that I see with individuals, as soon as they lose their faith somehow, and they become something else, but the behaviors are still the same. And if you look at statism, like in communist Russia, and what happened when those traditions were eliminated, something else actually replaced that. So the state actually became,
the new church.
The new church in a sense.
Yeah, I think that happens, and that's why I've always had a view, and it's a common view. I mean, it's been around forever that organized religion definitely has a political aspect to it. I mean, all you have to do is look at history. I mean, it may not be, necessarily built into the doctrines or the scriptures, but I mean, when it actually is expressed in the real world, I think it always ends up getting intermixed with, or at least has historically gotten very incestuous, as it were, with politics.
Yeah, but I think it has something a little bit more deeper too. I think there's an unconscious instinct that people have, regardless of what it is.
Definitely. That's why I think they're able to do that, because we have that. Humans have that, I think, tendency, that natural tendency to kind of put things on that higher pedestal, if you will.
Yeah.
That higher authority.
Yeah, and I think it has a sense to make sense of where we're at, where we're living, and what type of reality that we're even choosing for ourselves. Is no matter how objective we try to make it seem, it's fascinating stuff. That's why I was really into. That's why I think that's one of the reasons why I watch religious debates and just look at it and just observe it. And I was I was able to take a very humble approach on my position, and my what I call beliefs and the reality of the whole thing. So, it definitely had me looking very inward, my own self.
Mm-hmm. You mean watching these debates had that effect on you?
No, just even before that. But I wanted to see, I really wanted to see like how different perspectives reacted to different things, like having a dogmatic type of thought pattern, a very stringent, this is the truth, and regardless of what it is. And I seen even people, somewhat in my position, but in different faiths and different type of philosophy that has a different temperament, that has this concept of, hey, you know what, I could be wrong. And I noticed that they have a different type of attitude, but thus have a different type of I see a different type of behavior.
very more fluid, open-minded and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't really matter what position of belief or non-belief that you have. It's almost, for me, it's almost like the behavior itself. But yet you could actually see the thought pattern because you could actually hear it in their language. A very type of black and white type of thinking. Now,
Yeah, I mean, I think epistemologically we should all be open to anything as a possibility. But
that could be
at
very
least my
scary.
approach, open to anything but skeptical of everything.
Yeah. And that could be very scary for a lot of people.
Yeah, people. I think another psychological tendency of people is they want certainty, at least for certain things, in their outlook. They need that bedrock, just floating out there in space, no anchor. I think it's understandably scary, for a lot of people. It's nice to have that touchstone, that familiar touchstone, anchoring you and orienting you.
That's it's amazing. Definitely something to ponder about.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah, I think it was a very good hangout today.
Yeah, I liked it. I always learn a lot coming.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually wanted to get, probably next time I probably want to get into the concept of religion and why is it looked so negatively.
Mm-hmm.
And really look at not just the negative aspects of it, but really look at the positives and see why is it necessary for society, but not just like in the sense of keeping things in order, but what is the innate drive for people to organize in that way, and why is religion still relevant to this day, even with the growing science now? Is it now that faith in general is dying out, or is it growing, or it's?
I think it's transforming. I don't think it's going away.
It's transforming. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of, at least in the U.S., a lot of people seem to be moving away from that kind of dogmatic, very controlled Christian type of approach and branching out into more diverse, spirituality, and people are exploring Eastern stuff, exploring Buddhism. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people have a really uninformed view of some of the Eastern stuff, but they're getting like a bastardized American version of it. But yeah, people are branching out into all different ways. And there's the new thought people, new age stuff, all sorts of things. I think people are looking in different directions for a new path, kind of new approach.
Yeah, and I think that's a good subject for the next one.
Yeah, it'd be fun.
Yeah. It was the first time I actually stayed in the Interfaith hangout. I usually like pop in, pop out, pop in. This time I actually stayed, even though I have a horrible headache right now, like really bad, but just killing me. But hopefully next time I'll feel a little bit better.
Great. Well, I'm glad you all came. I appreciate your participation, and everybody has been able to say something really, really good tonight. So it's good. Let's keep it going, and we'll do it again sometime soon.